On December 31st, 1942, Japanese Admiral Matome Ugaki complains to his diary that the war in the Pacific is turning against the Japanese after a dramatic and promising start. The year 1942 is going to pass tonight. How brilliant was the first stage of operations, up to April, and what miserable setbacks since Midway in June. The invasions of Hawaii, Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, liberation of India, and destruction of the British Far Eastern Fleet have all scattered like dreams. Little does Ugaki know, worse days are ahead in the final phase of the Pacific War. In 1944 and 45, bloody battles multiply, and US forces push to the very shores of Japan, before delivering a mortal blow that ushers in a new age. By late 1943, the Pacific War is transforming. Japanese expansion is definitively over as General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area secures the approaches to Australia and captures Japanese-held territory in the Solomon Islands. Meanwhile, after the battles of Midway and Coral Sea, massively expanded US naval forces no longer play a cat-and-mouse game with the Japanese fleets, but shift to major sustained offensive operations. The Japanese go over to the defensive and create a national defense zone across the Pacific. Its outer edges anchor on so-called unsinkable aircraft carriers, island groups and atolls like the Marshall, Caroline, and Gilbert Islands that provide interlocking aerial cover. If US forces attack them, island garrisons will wear down the invaders and open the possibility of air and naval counterattack from Japanese bases at Rabaul and Truk. US admirals like Chester Nimitz and Ernest King also recognize that these island groups, many containing airfields and good anchorages, can function as stepping stones towards Japan. The Joint Chiefs of Staff debate the strategy, with MacArthur arguing it would divert resources from his South Pacific push. Nonetheless, at the January 1943 Casablanca Conference, the Allies order a Central Pacific campaign commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Island hopping is risky. Nimitz wants to bypass non-essential Japanese-held islands, which could potentially threaten US lines of communication. Furthermore, capturing islands means multiple amphibious invasions against prepared positions, arguably modern warfare's most difficult operation. The US Marines have an amphibious doctrine, but by 1943, most landings have been largely unopposed. Personalities also complicate planning. Admiral Kelly Turner and Marine General Holland Smith command the amphibious landing forces, but debate command structure. Both are known for their tempers, earning the nicknames Howling Mad Smith and Terrible Turner. Captain Carle Moore navigates the feud. Holland Smith particularly complained about Kelly Turner. He was a whining, complaining type. He would come and sit on my desk and growl about Turner. All I want to do is kill some Japs. Just give me a rifle. I don't want to be a commanding general. And Turner would come and complain about that blankety-blank Smith, couldn't get any cooperation out of him, and so forth. More compromises. Turner commands all amphibious forces until Smith moves ashore, a system that lasts until the end of the war. Initially, Nimitz wants to invade the Marshall Islands, but the Japanese base at Truk is a significant threat. Instead, Spruance settles for invading the Gilbert Islands, a Japanese-occupied British possession further from the major Japanese bases. From September 1943, Operation Galvanic targets islands in the Makin, Apimama, and Tarawa atolls, all occupied by the Japanese in late 1941. The Japanese mostly abandon Apimama, leaving only 25 Marines to watch for US movements, but defend Makin's seaplane base with 800 troops. Basio in the Tarawa Atoll is the most important and well defended, with an airfield and 4,850 Japanese troops, mostly crack Japanese Marines. But the island is tiny, 3.5 kilometers long and 600 meters wide, smaller than New York Central Park. Its highest point is 3 meters above sea level. For the defending Japanese, it prevents maneuver or defense in depth, but it does allow for quick troop deployment and for almost all weapons to hit anywhere on the island. For the attacking US, the enemy are fish in a barrel. but the Japanese will certainly contest the beaches, and US firepower may hit friendly troops. After a US raid on Makin in August 1942, Basio Commander Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki builds major defense works, including 500 bunkers, shore guns, and offshore obstacles. The southern coast is the best prepared, but all beaches are defended, while 14 reserve light tanks can strike anywhere. Basio might be, per meter, the most heavily defended position on Earth, and Shibazaki boasts about it. 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. US intelligence identifies defensive works from aerial and submarine photography, while former residents, mostly British, provide geographic information. But US aircraft make no low-level reconnaissance flights and miss many well-camouflaged, smaller positions. And the Americans don't have any diver teams to scout underwater obstacles. The 5th Amphibious Corps' 2nd Marine and 27th Infantry Divisions will attack Basio and Makin on November 20th, supported by Task Force 58's ships and carrier planes. On Basio, Planner Colonel David Shoup selects 3 landing beaches on the northern lagoon side. Landing Vehicles Tracked, or LVTs, originally logistical transports, will act as assault boats and land Marines directly ashore. LVTs carry the first 3 assault waves, while shallow-hulled landing craft carry waves 4 through 10. Former residents inform planners there should be enough water for landing craft to cross an offshore reef. New Zealander Frank Holland, though, warns 2nd Marine Division Commander Julian Smith the invasion date may coincide with a rare, ultra-low tide, but others disagree. Smith warns his officers but does not change the date. At 5 a.m. on November 20th, US ships, including 3 battleships, open fire on Basio with a 3-hour barrage. This is much less than the multi-day barrage that Smith requested, and things immediately go wrong. When the invasion command ship, battleship USS Maryland, fires its first salvo, the vibrations knock out its hastily installed communication equipment. Coordination with aircraft strikes is also poor. But to the waiting Marines, it's an impressive display and confidence is high. Fires burned from one end of Basio to the other. As I watched the destruction, I couldn't help thinking, how would anybody live through that? Although US ships knock out larger Japanese positions, smaller ones survive. Some shells ricochet off the island, while up to 25% of the 1,500 shells fired may miss it entirely. Japanese warrant officer Kiyoshi Ota is on the receiving end. This bombardment was violent beyond expression, a frightening and horrifying experience. It went on and on without ceasing. My position received a direct hit, but none of us were wounded. We were only buried by sand, which we quickly dug away. I still marvel that so many of us escaped with our lives during this period when heavy shells were falling on the island like rain. Meanwhile, empty LVTs pick up men from landing craft at sea despite difficult currents and inaccurate Japanese counterfire. Delays in forming up give Shibazaki time to redeploy men from the south coast. So US warships are pounding Tarawa, but the landings are delayed. At 9 a.m., after up to 5 hours of waiting, the first LVTs head for the beaches. One landing craft lands a scout sniper platoon on the long pier, temporarily clearing it of Japanese machine guns and snipers. Around 450 meters from the beaches, the tracked LVTs successfully cross the reef, surprising the Japanese. We could see the American landing craft coming towards us like dozens of spiders, scattering over the surface of the water. One of my men exclaimed, "The god of death has come." Once the thinly armored LVTs get inside the lagoon, Japanese defenders open fire. They're inaccurate, knocking out only 8 of 87 LVTs in the initial waves, but it's unnerving for Marines expecting minimal resistance. Correspondent Robert Sherrod recalls the approach. We jumped into the little tractor boat and quickly settled on the deck. "Oh God, I'm scared," said the little Marine, the telephone operator. I gritted my teeth and tried to force a smile that would not come. I said, in an effort to be reassuring, "I'm scared too." I never made a more truthful statement in all my life. Once the Marines hit the beaches, they take cover at the seawall. The Japanese expected this and pre-sighted the areas with mortars. This forces the Marines over the wall, where Japanese snipers and machine guns pick them off. Meanwhile, heavy fire, especially from a location later called the Pocket and from an offshore shipwreck, forces LVTs off their original course. Ships and planes eliminate the shipwreck defenders, but other Japanese swim out and reoccupy the positions. Many Marines group up around the relative cover of the pier and only create a very narrow beachhead. Soaked radios, officer casualties, and recurring communication problems mean US commanders lack situational awareness. But the first wave's casualties are tolerable. When the fourth wave's landing craft approach the beach, they make a terrible discovery. D-Day does coincide with a freak low tide, so the landing craft can't pass the reef. Some troops transfer to LVTs, but many wade up to 700 meters to shore. They are easy targets for the Japanese. About 500 yards out, the boat rammed into the reef and everyone was ordered over the side. I leapt out and went into water over my head. Everywhere there were knocked out tractors burning fiercely, men falling all around me, bodies and parts of bodies floating everywhere in the pink water. How anyone reached that shore is still a mystery to me. Half an hour elapsed before I put foot on dry land. The Japanese destroy more LVTs on return trips, forcing more men to wade ashore. Casualties increase dramatically, and a discouraging message from Red 1 finally reaches Julian Smith. Have landed. Unusually heavy opposition. Casualties 70%. Can't hold. By 11 a.m., Marines create tenuous positions west of Red 1 and either side of the pier on Red 2 and 3. Losses are especially high on Red 2, including the landing team commander. Colonel Shoup and Major Henry Crow establish a headquarters near the pier, while Major Michael Ryan on Red 1 shifts towards the unused Green Beach. Smith sends in the reserves, including the 6th Marine Regiment transferred from the Makin landing. Only when 7 Sherman tanks land on Red 3 do the Americans make any progress, but by evening, 5,000 Marines are still only 200 to 300 meters inland. The major threat is now a Japanese nighttime counterattack. So late on D-Day, the Marines cling to a vulnerable beachhead, and with enemy lines so close, US supporting fire risks hitting friendlies. An organized Japanese attack could eliminate the beachheads, but the Marines have scored a lucky break. In the afternoon of D-Day, a destroyer shell kills Shibazaki before he orders a counterattack, so there's no major Japanese night attack. Heavy casualties continue on D+1 as men again wade ashore, and US troops conduct a 3-pronged assault. Japanese defenders are disorganized and immobile, and Marines can now locate their bunkers and systematically reduce them with demolitions, flamethrowers, and tanks. Major Ryan's men secure Temacin Point, creating a safe landing beach, as other Marines cut the island in two. Shoup, later awarded the Medal of Honor for his command, radios to Smith. Casualties many, percentage dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Over the next 2 days, Marines clear Japanese forces from the west, concentrating them in the Pocket, while others head east. Early on D+3, US Marines destroy a Japanese banzai attack, killing 320. On the Pocket, US bulldozers push earth into bunkers, smothering defenders as US troops pour in gasoline and ignite it. Japanese resistance ends on D+3. On Beso, Marine Corps losses are 1,117 killed and missing and 2,292 wounded, almost as many Marine deaths in 3 days as during the 6-month campaign on Guadalcanal. Most casualties are in the later waves who waded ashore. Japanese dead number 4,690, 97% of the garrison. The US capture 146 prisoners, but only 17 are Japanese troops. The rest are Korean laborers. At the same time as the landings on Baiseo, the US 27th Infantry Division lands on Makin's main island of Putaritari, with 6,500 troops greatly outnumbering 800 Japanese. The US Army uses more conservative advances to contact before calling in supporting fire. Casualties are lower. but Marine officer Holland Smith is critical. He complains that Army tactics prolong the fighting, allow Japanese to entrench and inflict more casualties, and force support ships to stay nearby in vulnerable positions for longer. As if to prove his point, a Japanese submarine torpedoes the light carrier Liscombe Bay off Makin on November 24th, killing 687. The high US casualties caused controversy, especially after newspapers published photos of US dead for the first time in the war. Private military disagreements partially play out in public, with MacArthur calling the operation an unnecessary massacre of human lives. Critics framed the attack as a disaster despite the victory. However, US commanders are impressed by the LVT's ability to drop troops on the beach and hide this success for operational security reasons. They remind the public that amphibious landings are always risky and introduce the public to the realities of the Pacific War. A film called With the Marines at Tarawa plays extensively and later wins an Oscar. War bond sales increase, although Marine recruitment drops 35%. Commanders immediately identify the operation's failures. The use of battleships as command centers, poor waterproofing of equipment like radios, overladen troops in the assault waves, poor attention to tides, no underwater reconnaissance or demolitions, and problems moving troops onto LVTs at sea that left them at sea for too long. Analysts also find failure with the naval bombardment. It did destroy large guns and Japanese communications, but it's insufficient against bunkers and is poorly executed. Ships attacked too regularly with heavy shells, creating clouds which obscured observation and aerial attack. Ships also lift the bombardment too early, 25 minutes before the first landing, which gives the defenders time to reorganize. Officers also note a poor performance by aircraft, which often attacked randomly, as one pilot later admits. I'm reluctant to say I was involved in the so-called air support for the landing at Tarawa, for it was pretty sorry. We didn't really know what we were doing. So Tarawa is a very flawed American victory, and the lessons must be learned quickly. In early 1944, Central Pacific commanders want to take Kwajalein and Eniwetok atolls in the Marshall Islands to use as a forward base and replace Pearl Harbor. US forces waste no time making changes. The US produces more LVTs, including improved variants with factory-installed armor, turret-mounted guns, and rear ramps. Troops will now start the attack in LVTs and scrap the troublesome ship-to-ship transfer. Specialist underwater demolition teams will conduct reconnaissance and clear obstacles, while artillery will be based on smaller islands offshore of the main target. Shermans replace the lighter Stuart tanks, and there are improved flamethrower weapons, including tank-mounted versions. Smaller ships with specialized communications equipment will take over a command role, and landing troops receive better radios. Pre-landing bombardments will now be multi-day as originally requested. This means more escorts, anti-aircraft, and anti-submarine vessels to protect the bombarding fleet. And between November 1943 and January 1944, the US Navy's Task Force 58 almost doubles in size. Destroyers and rocket ships will conduct more of the barrage, which will continue right up to the moment that the troops land. Aircraft and ships will also attack together instead of one after the other. These improvements pay off at the Marshall Island landings on January 31st, 1944. US Marines land on the island of Roy Namur to light initial resistance. The pre-landing bombardment is much more effective, with a Navy report claiming it neutralizes 50 to 75% of the 2,000-strong Japanese garrison. Japanese resistance is heavier on Namur, but stops on the second day. US ships shell Kwajalein even more intensely, with 15,000 tons of explosives hitting the 2,000 Japanese defenders in just 72 hours. An officer on Turner's flagship comments, "Never in the history of human conflict has so much been thrown by so many at so few." US Army troops land on Kwajalein's western side to light resistance, and again use slower, methodical tactics. This gives the Japanese time to reinforce the east, where the battle bogs down. Still, airstrikes and new bombardments eliminate the defenders by D+4. Marine Commander Holland Smith remains unimpressed. I could see no reason why this division, with ample forces ashore, well covered by land-based artillery and receiving tremendous naval and air support, could not take the island quicker. The successful landings accelerate planning for a new attack. It's an excellent anchorage, but dangerously close to Japanese-held Truk. While US carrier planes and land-based bombers suppress Truk, a 10,000-strong Marine Army force lands on the Eniwetak, Nghibi and Parry Islands in late February. The attacks follow the new doctrine, and although fighting bogs down amidst well-camouflaged trenches, US troops secure all the islands within 3 days. The Marshall Island campaigns do not go perfectly. Some LVTs struggle to get ashore, Marine Army cooperation remains tense, and determined Japanese resistance inflicts casualties, with around 920 US killed and missing, and 2,340 wounded to capture all the islands. 11,180 Japanese troops are killed, almost all of the attacked islands' garrisons. Still, there's no repeat of the high US losses on Tarawa, and the success appears to vindicate Nimitz's Central Pacific strategy. The operations also reveal Japanese weakness. Major Japanese ships evacuate from Truk before the attack, but Operation Hailstone essentially destroys it from the air. Despite earlier concerns, bypass Japanese bases never become a major threat to US rear areas. Furthermore, although Japanese commanders order a naval counterattack at Tarawa, nothing really happens. The Japanese expect these outposts to fall and want to preserve what naval strength remains for a decisive battle closer to Japan. Some observers argue that the time between the Gilbert and Marshall Islands landings acted as a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. As Naval Quartermaster Roger Bond notes, "I think that for anyone that participated in the war, there were actually two wars. If you went out to the Pacific after, let's say, January of 1944, you had a completely different experience and viewpoint than those before, because it really was two different operations." This is partly due to a shift in doctrine, but also to the massive increase in US military power in the theater. After Eniwetak, Admiral Harry Hill commented on the availability of LVTs and supporting arms. "At Eniwetak, I felt like a millionaire. But at Tarawa, I was a pauper." Importantly, after years of US propaganda depicting the Japanese as racially inferior and attempts by the administration to shield the population from war, US troops and civilians now understand the Japanese are a dangerous foe. A December 1943 New York Times editorial reminded its readers, "We must steel ourselves now to pay that price." But that does not mean the US is close to victory. They're still far from Japan. The Japanese Navy is still a major threat, and command issues remain. Although Holland Smith and Turner repair their relationship, Smith still criticizes Army colleagues. Furthermore, it's now clear some islands can be bypassed, so there are more heated debates about which ones are necessary to take. The Japanese also react. They shift from beach defense towards developing an attritional strategy designed to bleed US forces in costly island battles. By early 1944, the US have refined their amphibious operations after Tarawa, but bloodier island battles await. US Pacific strategy is divided between General MacArthur's and Admiral Nimitz's commands. Through 1943, both commanders argue for prioritizing their areas and compete for the same troops, resources, and planning staff. Nimitz gains permission for a limited Central Pacific drive in May 1943, but after the success of Operation Galvanic, he develops further plans. Meanwhile, MacArthur pushes for an army-led operation towards the Philippines and then mainland China. Nimitz argues targeting China or the Philippines, which consists of 7,000 islands, requires too much manpower and gives the Japanese too many possibilities to withdraw to new positions, or to attack US forces from dispersed air bases. In the Central Pacific, US planners can select only the most vital islands, many of which are small, isolated, and out of air support range of other islands. The US could island hop its way to Formosa to help the Chinese in their war with Japan, and base bombers there for a potentially decisive air campaign. Since the Central Pacific needs resource-intensive naval and air forces, weakening the Japanese war economy will further strangle Japanese strategic options. Meanwhile, in the Philippines and China, Japan can still mobilize large, cheaper-to-maintain land forces. The Central Pacific Islands also have much smaller civilian populations, meaning the US can use its firepower while minimizing US and civilian casualties. Although there are practical strategic elements to MacArthur's Philippine-centric plan, his argument is mostly about honor and responsibility. MacArthur claims it's essential the US liberate the Philippines since they're a US protectorate. Doing so will also free thousands of Allied prisoners of war the Japanese are keeping in terrible conditions. He later wrote, "I argued that it was not only a moral obligation to release this friendly possession from the enemy, now that it had become possible, but that to fail to do so would not be understandable to the Oriental mind. Practically all of the 17 million Filipinos remained loyal to the United States and were undergoing the greatest privations and sufferings because we had not been able to support or succor them." Similarly, he argues the US must increase aid to Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces, which have been resisting Japanese invasion since 1937. However, contemporaries and historians argue MacArthur's main priority is personal prestige and a desire to redeem himself after his 1942 Philippines defeat. Nimitz's proposed Central Pacific drive will see the Navy play the primary role in defeating Japan, leaving few opportunities for MacArthur's army forces to contribute. MacArthur is also likely planning a post-war presidential election campaign, and liberating the Philippines and Allied prisoners will boost his reputation. On July 26th, Nimitz and MacArthur present their views to President Roosevelt at a conference in Honolulu. MacArthur is reportedly reluctant to attend, and likely believes Roosevelt is only hosting the conference to boost his approval ratings. Nonetheless, on August 9th, Roosevelt informs MacArthur that his approach via the Philippines has been approved over Nimitz's plan to advance to Formosa via the Central Pacific. "You have been doing a really magnificent job against what were great difficulties, given to us by climate and by certain human animals. As soon as I get back, I will push on that plan, for I am convinced that it is logical and can be done." Some historians have since suggested Roosevelt's decision is due to a desire to contain any public complaints from MacArthur and placate his conservative political allies. However, Nimitz also gets a Central Pacific campaign. American strength in the Pacific, especially the Navy, is such that the US can attempt both approaches. Although instead of advancing to Formosa, Nimitz gets another limited offensive into the Central Pacific to snatch new forward air bases from the Japanese. Suitable islands could almost be counted on the fingers of two hands. These, naturally, the Japanese had developed as bases, and there were no more. So when we moved across the Pacific and needed an air base, there was no alternative. We simply had to take one away from the Japanese. It's just that simple. As a result, the Japanese partially predict where the next blow will land, allowing them to prepare defenses and naval counterattacks. MacArthur's return to the Philippines would also help the American prisoners of war who languished in prison camps like Cabanatuan. During the Philippines campaign, American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas would liberate several Japanese prison camps in daring raids behind enemy lines. If you want to learn more about the Cabanatuan raid, check out our new series History's Most Daring Raids. And where can you watch History's Most Daring Raids? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building with other creators where you don't need to sift through a deluge of AI slop. Nebula is made and curated by humans, and it's available in 4K resolution on your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. And that's not all. On Nebula, you can also watch all our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. And all that for just $36 for an entire year if you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory. Nebula is also a great gift, by the way. Just go to gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to give an entire year to family and friends, even if they already have an account. Whether you watch Nebula on your own or give it to someone else, you're supporting us here at Real Time History directly. The Mariana Islands stretch for roughly 750 kilometers across the Central Pacific and are at the core of the Japanese National Defense Zone, with air bases on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Saipan and Tinian are pre-war Japanese colonies geared towards sugarcane cultivation, although large-scale Japanese settlement has turned the indigenous Chamorro people into a minority. Japan invaded and occupied Guam, a US territory, in 1941. Fifth Fleet Commander Admiral Raymond Spruance plans to capture Saipan and Tinian first, establish US air bases there, and then move on to Guam. The 5th Amphibious Corps, consisting of 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, with the supporting 27th Infantry Division and 24th Corps Artillery, will assault Saipan. US planners select 4 beaches codenamed Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow on the southwestern coast for the landings. However, the 2 assaulting Marine Divisions will be separated by a Fetna Point, while reefs near the beaches limit landing craft. Instead, the assault waves prioritize LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, which can drive over reefs and onto the beaches. Unusually, 5th Amphibious Corps orders the Marines to ride the LVTs inland instead of dismounting on the beaches. Although the 4th Marine Division accepts the plan, the 2nd Marine Division is skeptical. They know LVTs struggled with rugged terrain on Guadalcanal, although their rivalry with the LVT's army drivers also contributes to the tensions. 5th Amphibious Corps Commander General Holland Smith expects the Marines to reach the Objective 1 line, 1.3 kilometers inland, by the end of D-Day. He anticipates the south will be captured quickly before a final push north. All told, around 95,000 US troops are available to assault and garrison the island. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is tasked with defending the Mariana Islands. He'd previously led the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Midway and has since fallen out of favor with the Imperial Navy. The local garrison under General Yoshitsugu Saito has around 32,000 men of the 43rd Division, 41st Independent Mixed Brigade, as well as some air and navy units, but they're poorly prepared. There's high ground inland for artillery observation and rear lines, but the Japanese lack transport, troops, and coordination. Reinforcements do arrive in May, but US submarines sink some supply ships and troop transports. This worsens the already rocky relationship between the Japanese Navy and Army. Even so, Saito divides Saipan into 4 defensive zones and positions his artillery on the high ground to counter a landing. He assumes the US will land in the southwest and prepares the 9th Tank Regiment to rapidly counterattack any US landings. While the Japanese army plans the island's defense, the Navy develops Operation Ago. The first mobile fleet, including the most modern carriers, will sail to the Marianas and attack the US invasion fleet. With the aid of land-based aircraft on the islands, Japan hopes it can deliver a mortal blow to Allied operations in the Pacific. Spruance is concerned about such an attack and orders Task Force 58, his fast carrier force, to remain defensive, much to the annoyance of its commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, who prefers aggressive action. And so, only a week after Allied troops land in Normandy, US troops in the Pacific prepare their own D-Day. In terms of firepower, the Saipan Naval Armada is even stronger than that of Operation Overlord in Europe. On D-Day -3, US warships and aircraft bombard Japanese airfields and defenses on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. US forces also fire white phosphorus into Saipan's sugarcane fields in a failed attempt to burn them clear. Japanese civilian Shizuko Miura witnesses the bombardment on Saipan. "I gazed at the sky for the enemy plane. It was a great formation which seemed to consist of hundreds, no, many thousands. Until war came to Saipan, I had never seen a dead man's face. So I might not have known death. But before my eyes, these 2 soldiers lay dead as if to teach me, look, this is death itself." US firepower levels the towns of Garapan and Charankanoa, destroys coastal guns, and disrupts communication between Japanese units. But overall, the battleship's fire proves disappointing, as they've been trained to hit targets on the sea. While the ships are firing, underwater demolition teams survey landing beaches and mark channels for larger vessels carrying tanks. Before the main invasion on June 15th, the Marines launch feints to the north to confuse the Japanese, but the defenders are not fooled. At around 8:40 a.m., the first assault wave of Marines, with support from the Army's amphibious tractor battalions, heads for the beaches. Around 700 landing craft and LVTs, including amphibious tank versions and gunboat, rocket, and command and control variants, will land 8,000 Marines in the first wave. Vessels and aircraft maintain fire support until LVTs are 100 meters from shore, but already the plan goes wrong. Japanese fire increases as LVTs cross the reef, while unexpected tides shift the 2nd Marine Division north, meaning units land at the wrong beaches, creating gaps and traffic jams. As LVTs crowd the beaches, pre-sighted Japanese artillery and mortars, many well camouflaged and untouched by the bombardment, inflict the most casualties. Still, within 20 minutes, the first wave of Americans is on shore, but rocky and swampy terrain, as well as the need to close gaps, limit their progress. Although 98% of 4th Marine Division's LVTs land, only half make it 300 meters inland. US amphibious tanks also struggle. Heavy swells immobilize some offshore, and others bog down fighting in Charankanoa. Although they destroy 11 counterattacking Japanese tanks, few reach the line on schedule. Meanwhile, Marine depot companies, including many African-American Marines, are established on shore to handle logistics, but quickly find themselves under fire from Japanese mortars and bypass defenders in hidden positions. While some Americans attempt to push through inland marshes, others struggle to link the 2 Marine divisions. 2 battalions of the 8th Marines fight across Green 2 Beach to assault Afetna Point. Half of 8th Marines G Company is armed with shotguns, both for close quarters fighting and to limit firing into friendlies coming from Blue Beach. Saipan was not the last time Marines would use shotguns during island assaults. We talked to Jonathan Ferguson, keeper of firearms and artillery at the Royal Armouries, about the Model 12 shotgun.
Hello everyone, Jonathan here at the Royal Armouries, and I have in front of me the Winchester Model 1912, or by this point, because this is made as a combat shotgun in the Second World War, the Winchester Model 12, just a change in name that took place. It's kind of doubly iconic for being, well, it's a pump-action shotgun. It's working in the traditional pump-action fashion, so single shot, you have to cycle the action between shots. You have an 8-round tube magazine underneath. This is just standard to the civilian and commercial version, of which an awful lot were made. What makes this a military weapon are, well, the markings. We have US service markings, US and the flaming bomb of the US Ordnance Department on there, which denotes the gun itself as a military issue piece of kit. A lot of them have a flat grey finish that looks very World War II American. This is a blued one. But the real star of the show with this thing is the bayonet. So this is the standard service bayonet for the Model 1917 Enfield rifle of the prior conflict. Because this bayonet mount, and actually the heat shield as well, it's all one unit that can be removed and refitted if necessary, was designed for the Winchester 1897. Really more of a shotgun for guarding prisoners with, funnily enough. It's thought to be a combat shotgun. Didn't see a huge amount of combat in the First World War, despite the famous German protests. But the Second World War successor, the Winchester Model 12, absolutely did see routine military action. So this has the scabbard on there, we'll just remove that. And this really makes it a truly, whether you are keeping prisoners of war in order, or whether you are charging the beaches or the trenches, this is a formidable weapon. The bayonet itself is pretty terrifying and gives you quite a bit of reach. And of course the buckshot, the 8 shots of buckshot ammunition coming out of this thing is pretty devastating at closer range. Now, we're used to, from popular culture, basically we get shotguns wrong all the time. Whether that's people getting blown 2 meters away from the shot, blown through windows, blown through walls, or whether it's to do with the spread of shot being absolutely huge. Some video games, the effect is essentially, it's like the shot has hit an invisible wall and you're not able to do damage beyond that. These are actually better at distance than people give them credit for, and they would allow the soldier to reach out a bit further if he needed to. That said, the effective range, roughly, of something like this is really no more than 20 meters, I would say, in terms of having enough effect to be truly fight-stopping. It's not a substitute for a rifle. There were, I believe, on Saipan, the Marines were carrying their rifle, and like one in every 2 Marines was also carrying one of these shotguns. Unwieldy, heavy, not ideal, but it gave you the ability to fight very, very competently at close quarters and then reach out with the rifle. But broadly speaking, you're going to be stuck with one or the other. Now, the other issue here is ammunition. So back in Guadalcanal in 43, 44, they had encountered issues with the paper. It's a thick paper shell was the original type of ammunition for this, which was standard at the time in the civilian world as well. Works perfectly well out on a grouse moor or shooting turkeys out in the mountains or whatever. Not so great in a hot and humid climate as at Guadalcanal. So the shells would swell and stick, and you might not be able to load them into the magazine tube underneath here. And if you did, they'd been in there overnight, and you cycle the gun, you may have a stoppage. And it was recommended at that time that the rounds be changed to a sheet brass shell hull. But that, as far as I can tell, was not enacted, or at least it wasn't enacted quickly enough. So I believe that at Saipan, they were still using the paper cartridges that could swell and stick, which is not ideal. So a niche weapon, a limited weapon in some ways, but if you are in a trench or even storming a beach, working your way through breastworks, the open trenches that were at Saipan, this thing is fantastic. Getting out, if you get outside the other side of those trenches, you're going to want your rifle back. Even if, as a Marine, that might still be the bolt-action 1903 Springfield rather than the semi-automatic M1 Garand. So, and then the combat shotgun, the Model 12 specifically, and then combat shotguns in general, have carried on to the present day with a very niche application, be that blowing hinges off doors to gain entry to somewhere, or actual fighting shotguns, which we saw used in the Afghanistan conflict. These are still a realistic proposition today.
But even with new tactics, the Marines failed to clear Fetna Point and link up the divisions by nightfall. At the end of D-Day, US forces occupy only half the objective area, with around 2,000 US casualties, especially officers. Although units reach the base of Mount Finasusa, they withdraw to safer positions for expected Japanese counterattacks overnight. Japanese troops do attack, but they're disorganized and desperate. In one attack, Japanese troops advance behind women and children as human shields. American tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire stop all of the attacks. On D+1, the 27th Infantry Division lands with more artillery as Marines consolidate the beachhead, make modest advances, and link up the divisions. In the early hours of D2, a major Japanese armored counterattack targets the 2nd Marine Division. Poorly organized and forced by terrain to advance in columns, the Japanese break into US positions, but US tanks, half-track mounted AT guns, and bazookas stop them. Japanese infantry riding the tanks suffer heavily, and US fire destroys at least 24 of 44 attacking tanks. Tank crewman Shiro Shimoda recalls. Most of the infantrymen on our tanks were killed or simply abandoned us. The leading parts of the columns advanced deeply into the US lines, and a confused fight developed. Star shells were lighting up our tanks, and American gun and bazooka fires were destroying them. American M4 Sherman tanks suddenly appeared, and we opened fire on them, but our shells bounced off them like baseballs. The battle is the largest tank-on-tank engagement of the Pacific War. By D+3, the 4th Marine Division cuts the island in two, while the 27th Infantry Division capture Aslito Airfield, creating a Japanese pocket on Nafutan Point. The Japanese 43rd Division has lost half its battalions and 2/3 of its artillery. General Saito radios Tokyo. Have received your honorable imperial words. By becoming the bulwark of the Pacific with 10,000 deaths, we hope to acquire imperial favor. While the fighting rages on Saipan, US submarines track the Japanese first mobile fleet. Spruance worries they might try to distract his larger protective ships and sneak through fast destroyers in a night attack against the invasion armada. In reality, the Japanese plan a decisive air attack on Task Force 58's own carriers. On June 18th, Japanese land-based bombers attacked Task Force 58 with little effect. The next day, at a range of around 570 kilometers, Mobile Fleet Commander Jisaburo Ozawa launches his carrier planes. It's too far for them to return, so they plan to land on Guam after their attack and allow Ozawa's carriers to stay out of range of Task Force 58. Ozawa sends the roughly 450 carrier planes in smaller waves, while the US scrambles all available fighters to meet them. Japanese aircraft often meet double the number of US planes, along with anti-aircraft fire over Task Force 58. The result is the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More powerful, modern US planes like the F-6F Hellcat inflict heavy losses. Few Japanese aircraft mount attacks on the fleet, and no US ship suffers serious damage. At the end of the raid, the Japanese lose 358 carrier planes, and the US only 33. US submarines also attacked the Japanese fleet, sinking the carriers Taiho and Shokaku. Ozawa accepts his failure and withdraws on June 20th. Mitscher is allowed to pursue, but Spruance's previous defensive orders mean Ozawa gets a significant head start. When Mitscher launches his planes at a range of about 480 kilometers, he knows they don't have enough fuel to return, but he hopes his carriers will catch up with them during the battle to shorten their return flight. 216 US aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet, which now has little fighter cover. Grumman TBF Avengers from the carrier Belleau Wood sink the carrier Hio. The carrier below looked big, tremendous, almost make-believe. I had a moment of real joy. I'd often dreamed of something like this. Then I was horrified with myself. I must be crazy. I was straight up and down now in my dive. I was right in the middle of all those white puffs, and for the first time I could see where they were coming from. From each side of the carrier below seemed to be a mass of flashing red dots. I thanked whoever it was who laid on the last one, as it had stopped the carrier right up and down in my sights. Navy aircraft also damaged 3 other ships, but not all make it back. 80 aircraft either ditch into the sea or crash on flight decks from a lack of fuel. US ships recover 143 of the 177 aircrew that do ditch. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is a decisive US victory. The Japanese lose 3 carriers, including their largest and most modern, to 0 US naval losses. And Japan's remaining carriers have only 35 aircraft between them, rendering them useless. Including land-based planes, the Japanese lose 476 aircraft and 445 pilots, losses they can hardly replace. The US loses around 130 aircraft, most to non-combat causes. Overall, Japan loses around 3,000 men compared to the US's 109. So the US is victorious at sea, but Mitscher is frustrated Spruance held him back. Spruance's defenders, though, argue that given the Japanese skill at stealthy night attacks, his defensive stance makes sense. Back on Saipan on D-Day +7, US forces start their push north to the heights of Mount Tipo Pale, Mount Tapochau, and Hill 600. But the terrain is rugged, and their advance slows to a crawl. Where they can't use vehicles, the soldiers start using local oxen to transport equipment. The 2nd Marine Division and 27th Infantry Division struggle against ravines and ridges dubbed Death Valley, Hell's Pocket, and Purple Heart Ridge, while the 4th Marine Division has more success in the east. Marine Commander Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith accuses the 27th Infantry Division of lacking aggressiveness and successfully pushes to relieve its commander. However, this makes little difference. Some argue the 27th Infantry Division are fighting through the toughest Japanese strongpoints, although others claim the Army's slow, methodical approach is unsuitable for this kind of battlefield. Still, Japanese resistance is crumbling. US destroyers prevent Japanese reinforcements from Tinian, and Japanese units can't function coherently. Roughly 2,000 to 3,000 troops remain in the north, but Saito can only communicate with around 950 of them. With all artillery destroyed or captured, Saito messages Tokyo again. Please apologize deeply to the Emperor that we cannot do better than we are. Meanwhile, US troops are able to more effectively communicate and coordinate their attacks. Supporting the Marines are Native American code talkers, specially trained radio men who use a code derived from the Navajo language to quickly and securely communicate tactical information. Whereas it could take mechanical equipment 30 minutes to encrypt and decrypt 3 lines of English text, code talkers could do it in about 20 seconds. On D+11, the 6th Marines bypass enemy positions to capture a ridge linking the 2 mountains. That night, the isolated Japanese troops in Nafutan Point infiltrate out and attack the airfield, where the Americans eliminate them. Marine units also adapt to the nature of the battlefield. At night, they send aggressive recon units ahead and successfully preempt Japanese night infiltrations. They clear the Japanese out of the caves with a mix of small arms, bazookas, and M3A1 Satan flamethrower tanks. The super-hot flames reached 60 to 80 yards, deep within caves, and lapped over the top and sides of cliffs. If the flames didn't make contact, concealed troops were often asphyxiated. Captain Ed Bollard and Lieutenant Brendan just shook their heads in disbelief over how precious life could become so cheap in this enlightened age. Coordination between Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Forces also improves as they learn the other's limitations. On D+12, by exploiting the success of the 4th Marine Division, the 2nd Marine Division and 27th Infantry Division are finally able to surround Hell's Pocket, allowing for gains in Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge. By D+15, the Japanese withdraw to their last line of defense. As the Battle of Saipan reaches its final days, Japanese soldiers and civilians alike refuse to be taken alive. Between D+16 and D+19, US forces advanced north, capturing Garapan and Tanapeg Harbor and breaching the final defenses. On D+20, the 27th Infantry Division take over the west of the line around the coast. The Japanese Navy promises reinforcements and encourages Saito to conduct guerrilla warfare. But with the US advancing on his command post, Saito issues his final orders. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death, there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver still another blow to the American devils and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark in the Pacific. In the early hours of July 7th, Saito orders a banzai attack against the 27th Infantry Division's 105th Infantry, with up to 3,000 men, many of them unarmed, and the last 3 tanks. Officially, Saito orders the charge to recapture Garapan and push for Nafutan Point, where he believes isolated Japanese troops remain. Considering this unrealistic objective, others claim the attack is in fact a gyokusai, or suicide charge, with no tactical goal. The charge, advancing in 3 columns, overruns 2 US Army battalions who hadn't incorporated the advanced scouting method from the Marines. They fall back and attempt to form new perimeters as the banzai fans out into the valley. But these perimeters fail as Japanese troops continue their charge, overrunning Marine artillery and attempting to surround the headquarters at Tanapeg. US troops create a perimeter and call in artillery, firing 2,700 rounds at Japanese formations in a single hour. However, shells also hit isolated US troops, some of whom swim offshore to be rescued by destroyers. At around 8 a.m. July 7th, the charge is now exhausted, disorganized, and falling apart. US reinforcements arrive, and a US tank platoon pushes through to the banzai's staging area, eliminating the remaining Japanese. Despite his orders, Saito did not join the charge himself, but committed ritual suicide beforehand. Afterwards, US troops count 4,311 Japanese dead in the area, although it's unclear how many were directly involved. US casualties are 451 killed and 594 wounded. Some Japanese officers, such as Captain Sakae Oba, also consider the charge a waste and refuse to join, instead infiltrating back into the Central Highlands. Generally, however, the charge ends the Japanese resistance on Saipan, but tragedy continues. As US forces move north, Japanese civilians and remaining troops commit suicide with explosives or by jumping off of cliffs. American attempts via loudspeakers and interpreters to convince them to surrender achieve little. In many cases, civilians are likely coerced into killing themselves and their families by Japanese troops, some of whom forbid surrender. Japanese propaganda claims the US tortures and murders prisoners, and US actions such as indiscriminate firing, mutilating bodies, and displaying remains on vehicles may add to this impression. Ultimately, the close nature of fighting on Saipan makes surrender dangerous and makes it hard for troops to differentiate between military and civilian targets. Marine Lieutenant Lewis Myers recalls, "We knew we would find thousands of civilians beyond the beaches, but we did not count on meeting them in the midst of battle, especially the little children. Marines, many with children at home and pictures in their wallets, find it hard to fit these kids into the battle. Throwing grenades at Japs is what you were there for, but you hate to find babies in the same holes and caves from which the Japs have been firing." On July 9th, D+24, Smith declares Saipan secure, although mopping up takes months. Captain Oba and his unit only surrender in December 1945 after more than a year of harassing and killing American soldiers on the island. During the invasion, the US Army and Marines lose 3,142 killed, 13,208 wounded, and 335 missing. 20% of these casualties occur in the first 2 days. Of the 31,600 Japanese troops, 29,500 are killed, about 6,000 of which remain in collapsed caves and bunkers. The US capture 1,810, half of them Koreans fighting with Japanese forces. An estimated 22,000 civilians are killed, with an additional 14,700 interned in US camps. Soon after Saipan, US forces invade Tinian and Guam. Much like on Saipan, the Japanese garrisons are unprepared but determined to fight to the last. The Marines apply their expertise from Saipan. LVTs with ramps get off the beach quicker, and aircraft based on Saipan drop new napalm bombs. On Tinian, the Marines feint a landing against the main Japanese defenses, but then land further north and successfully attack the Japanese flanks. Tinian's flatter terrain and fire support from Saipan and the fleet allows the Americans to advance quickly despite the start of the typhoon season. On Guam, the landing zones allow for a US pincer movement around the port and the airfield. But heavy Japanese resistance, tough terrain, including jungle-like conditions, and poor weather slow the US advance. On both islands, Japanese soldiers hide among civilians and eventually force them into mass suicides, although in one case, American interpreters do prevent deaths. By early August, the US secures both islands at a cost of 9,500 US, 24,000 Japanese, and 3,200 civilian casualties. Some Japanese soldiers retreat to fight a guerrilla war or simply hide, in some cases, for decades. The Saipan landing was just a week after D-Day in Normandy, and it was just as decisive in the Pacific theater. The Americans pierced the Japanese defensive barrier, recovered Guam, and now had a clear path towards Japan's home islands. The fact the US was able to conduct such an ambitious operation while simultaneously launching the invasion of Europe is testament to the sheer scale of its military buildup and strategic reach by 1944. Historian James D. Hornfisher also claimed the Marianas ushered in total war to the Pacific. There was no explaining away what thousands of Marines had observed with their own disbelieving eyes in the Marianas. The ritual suicides of the Japanese garrisons and their predatory brainwashing and murder of the innocent unarmed have been insufficiently considered as a turning point that shaped the war's final year. The first direct US experience of total war occurred in the Marianas, and it renewed the will to win and to win totally, using all means available without restraint. As the fighting moved closer to Japan, it also became more radical, as Japanese commanders compensated for a lack of material or strategic options with renewed concepts of spiritual and racial superiority. As resistance, however ill-fated, increased, the boundaries of war extended and the lines between civilians and soldiers became blurred for both sides. Japanese civilian Shinozuka Yoshitaro recalled, "A soldier told me, 'We are no longer soldiers. You are no longer civilians. We are all just Japanese, and we all suffer the same.'" That the fighting on Saipan and elsewhere in the Pacific has been described as total war is also connected to the racial aspect of the war. Just as Nazi ideas about the Germans as a master race and Slavs and Jews as subhumans influenced the character of the war in Europe, so too did such ideas in Asia. As Japan developed its imperial policy and ideology in the years leading up to the war, it also adopted some European-inspired ideas about race. This merged with traditional negative ideas about outsiders into the concept of the Japanese as a natural master race in Asia. Many also argued their Yamato race was more pure than others, which helped justify imperial ambitions to rule over most of Asia. When the war against the US and European powers began, Japanese propaganda used race as a focus, denigrating the whites as lesser humans, or even devils. Japanese propagandists often portrayed British or Americans as animals, or human beings with horns, fangs, claws, or tails, associating them with traditional demons. Some classroom posters even bore the phrase, "Kill the American devils." Race was also a major factor in the American view of the war. Ideas about the inferiority of Japanese and other Asians were not new, but reached a fever pitch during the war. Propaganda images consistently portrayed the Japanese as physically inferior or malformed, as insects or as animals like rats and especially monkeys. Many Americans also believed that Japanese would forever be enemies or untrustworthy due to permanent racial characteristics, as one congressman declared. Once a Jap, always a Jap. You can't anymore regenerate a Jap than you can reverse the laws of nature. This judgment often extended to US citizens of Japanese origin, who the US government had interned in camps during the war. The Pacific Race War helps explain why both sides often saw the enemy as less human than them, resulting in a lower threshold for violence and atrocities. By summer 1944, US forces in the Pacific have pierced the Japanese National Defense Zone. As Admiral Chester Nimitz's US Pacific Fleet island hops from Tarawa to the Marianas, General Douglas MacArthur's Allied armies advanced through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea to isolate the major Japanese base at Rabaul. MacArthur wants to liberate the Philippines and hopes to advance to Morotai Island as a launch pad towards Mindanao. He also wants to secure his flanks by seizing the Palau Islands, including Peleliu. Commanders assign Operation Stalemate to Nimitz's 3rd Amphibious Corps, centered around the 36,000 men of the 1st Marine Division and the Reserve 81st Infantry Division. It will be the reactivated 81st Infantry Division's first battle, while the 1st Marine Division has fought several. However, by September 1944, 40% of the Marines are fresh replacements. But Japanese resistance delays the capture of the Marianas in July 1944 and impacts stalemate planning. Resources and personnel stay in the Marianas, leaving less experienced planners to work on stalemate. Initially, stalemate was to capture all the Palau Islands, but the delay means the US will only target Peleliu, Angaur, and Nisibis. When 3rd Amphibious Corps Commander Major General Roy Geiger takes over planning, there is no time to change the plans before the September 15th start date. However, just days before D-Day, Western Pacific Task Force Commander Admiral William Halsey argues for cancelling the renamed Stalemate 2. His aircraft detect minimal enemy presence in Mindanao and suggests bypassing Morotai and the Palaus in favor of invading Leyte Island in the Philippines. But Nimitz argues the Palau landings must happen. The Palaus provide an excellent anchorage, and troops are already on the way. 1st Marine Division Commander Major General William Rupertus assures him the battle will be quick. It will be a short operation, a hard-fought quickie that will last 4 days, 5 at the most, and may result in a considerable number of casualties. You can be sure, however, that the 1st Marine Division will conquer Peleliu. In the end, the Peleliu attack goes ahead, and Nimitz's decision becomes one of the most controversial of the Pacific War. Japan assumes the US will invade all the Palaus, which contains several air and naval bases, so most troops remain on Babeltuop, the largest island. But they correctly predict the US will start in the south and heavily reinforce Peleliu and Angaur with roughly half the Palau Island garrison. The 14th Division, redeployed from China, forms the core. It's considered elite and is reformed as an island defense formation with navy, stranded aviation, and construction personnel providing support. It also adopts new tactics. In previous island battles, Japanese defenders try to stop the invasion at the water's edge, but suffer under heavy bombardment. New orders encourage more conservative tactics, contesting landings, but also developing defense in depth. They aim to draw out island battles to drain Allied resources. A new operational manual states, in view of the tendency of the enemy, by means of an overwhelming superior naval and aerial bombardment, to intercept and control our reinforcements, it is absolutely necessary to make practical use of terrain, natural objects, lulls in enemy fire, weather, atmospheric phenomena, especially squalls, clouds, mist, and smoke. There will be no rapid exhaustion of battle strength if we pay careful attention to these details. The Japanese now reject Banzai charges as ineffective and wasteful, since US forces have long since learned to counter them with thorough planning and preparations. Marine Captain George Hunt claims their psychological impact has also diminished. When he screams Banzai, it is to convince himself of his own spirit. If it's to undermine our spirit, it is a pathetic endeavor. On Peleliu, Japanese commanders Colonel Kunio Nakagawa and Major General Kenjiro Murai focus on key geographic features like the Amurbrogel Mountains and prepared blockhouses. These positions, like a location known as the Point, are built into coral features and reinforced with concrete and steel casemates. Networks of caves allow movement between positions, and beach mines and obstacles force invaders into pre-sighted kill zones. The Japanese remove civilians before the battle, including native Palauans. A Japanese officer came to us with a Niesius man translating. We were told to take all our belongings to the wharf at Elachel. He was harsh. He had a sword and said, if you stay behind, you'll be considered a spy and killed. Although the US knows Japanese troop numbers, they do not know about the shift in tactics or the scale of the defensive works. Vegetation hides Japanese preparations, while the Americans lack maps. US pre-invasion bombardment starts on September 12th, and 2 days later, they claim to have destroyed all their targets. So when US forces start their amphibious attack on D-Day, September 15th, resistance is expected to be light. But as amphibious tractors approach the beaches, this illusion is dispelled. US commanders select 5 beaches on Peleliu's southwestern coast, codenamed White 1 and 2 and Orange 1, 2, and 3. The beaches are narrow with coconut groves for cover and close to Peleliu's airfield. Planners identify the Point as a dangerous position, but hope the pre-landing bombardment will crush the defenders. Landing vehicles, tracked or LVTs, as well as armed variants, will lead the attack, driving over an offshore reef and delivering the first assault waves of Marines from the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marine Regiments. The LVTs will then shuttle follow-up waves from the reef 500 meters offshore. After ships and aircraft launch another bombardment from 5 to 7 a.m., the first LVTs approach the beaches. 5th Marine's Sterling Mace is on board one of them. Suddenly, the LST's doors opened wide, letting the dawn's light shed on us. One after another, the LVTs splashed into the sea and in full throttle left the LST behind in its wake. But looking at the faces of my buddies around me, I had mixed emotions. Some were dead serious, with furrows across their brows. Some were laughing and nervously joking. However, if the tractor made an uncommon groan or hit a high peak of an underwater coral reef, the look of borderline panic would flush their faces. As the LVTs cross the reef, they immediately come under Japanese bombardment. Machine guns and automatic cannons add to the defense when Marines are 50 meters from the beaches. When the LVTs arrive, the Marines immediately take casualties. In the first minutes, the Japanese destroy numerous LVTs, which limits the number available to bring subsequent waves. Japanese resistance is heaviest around White 1 Beach. Of the 18 Sherman tanks assigned to 1st Marines, only 1 arrives undamaged. The 1st Marines advance about 100 meters inland, but come under heavy fire from a previously unidentified ridge. Meanwhile, the point envelops the entire beach with fire. Captain Hunt's K Company, which has already suffered 15% casualties, moves inland to attack from the landward side. Lieutenant William Willis describes the action. I sat down on a rock, lit a cigarette, and tried to figure the best way to knock out this pillbox. A squad covered the rear exit. I threw a smoke grenade just in front of the embrasure. I ran over to Anderson, who was about to aim a rifle grenade at the embrasure. The grenade launched perfectly and ignited something inflammable. I heard the Japs screaming. 3 Japs, with bullets popping in their belts and flames clinging to their legs, raced for the exit. The squad I had placed there finished them off. Hunt's team captures the point, but the 1st Marines are vulnerable. Gaps form between units, although the Japanese make no attempt to exploit them. Japanese resistance is lighter on Orange 1 and 2, but increases again on Orange 3, where Japanese automatic weapons and mortars fire from offshore islands. This forces some LVTs to drop troops assigned to Orange 3 on Orange 2, adding to the confusion. Journalist Tom Lee is embedded with the 7th Marines. I fell flat on my face just as I heard the whish of a mortar that I knew was too close. Moments later, I saw another man stagger in the direction of the LVTs. His face was half bloody pulp, and the mangled shreds of what was left of an arm hung down like a stick. The half of his face that was still human had the most terrible look of abject patience I have ever seen. He fell in a red puddle on the white sand. The 7th Marines also run into an unidentified anti-tank ditch, but this actually provides them cover and a place to reorganize. However, an unmapped swamp hinders the advance. With casualties mounting, Rupertus sends in reserve units despite receiving no requests for them. Several Marine officers later criticized the decision. The enemy was groggy, disorganized, and devoid of communications, although bitterly defending every step of the way. At no point did we feel him capable of organizing a successful counterattack. We at no time requested reinforcement, and in fact recommended against it since the beachhead was already overcrowded. At 5:30 p.m., 500 Japanese infantry and around 13 Hago light tanks launch a counterattack across the nearby airfield. Although initially disciplined, it falls apart as tanks advance full throttle and leave the infantry behind. The 5th Marines are prepared for such an attack and destroy all but 2 of the tanks. By nightfall on September 15th, the Marines are ashore but fail to achieve their D-Day objectives. K Company remains isolated on the point and fends off more counterattacks, while some Japanese units attempt night infiltrations. By D-Day +1, the 1st Marine Division has suffered 1,100 casualties, including 200 killed. Deaths among officers and lost communication equipment mean that the full scale of the casualties may not be known to commanders. Many men are also sick or suffering heat exhaustion. Water arrives in poorly cleaned gasoline containers, causing sickness. The objectives for D+1 include linking up with the point and securing the airfield. At the airfield, Marines charge across open ground overlooked by Japanese concrete buildings and bracketed by Japanese mortars. Several Marines, including Eugene Sledge, highlight the airfield attack as especially horrific. For me, the attack resembled World War I movies I'd seen, of suicidal Allied infantry attacks through shell fire on the Western Front. The farther we went, the worse it got. The noise and concussion pressed in on my ears like a vice. To be shelled in the open is terror compounded beyond the belief of anyone who hasn't experienced it. The attack across Peleliu's airfield was the worst combat experience I had during the entire war. By the following day, Marine units pushed the Japanese from the airfield, advance across the island, and secure the south. Japanese resistance now stiffens in the Amur-Brogel Mountains, and the 1st Marines continue to suffer casualties as they advance. The push is hindered by the maze-like structure of the coral ridges. It's almost impossible for Marines to dig in, while the coral creates additional problems. The jagged rocks slashed their shoes and clothes and tore their bodies every time they hit the deck for safety. Casualties were high for the simple reason that it was impossible to get under the ground away from the Japanese mortar barrages. Each blast hurled chunks of coral in all directions, multiplying many times the fragmentation effect of every shell. Fighting centers on Hill 200 and 205, with US and Japanese positions forming salients in the others' lines. Marines climb near vertical inclines, while Japanese troops pop in and out of caves to fire on them. By D+2, the 1st Marines has suffered 1/3 casualties and used non-combat personnel as riflemen. Meanwhile, on D+2, the 81st Infantry Division land on Angaur to lighter resistance, although Japanese troops utilize similar defensive techniques and refuse to be taken alive. Out they came. The first guy was swinging a samurai sword. I shot the sword bearer and then went to a squatting position and fired away as the Japs came out of the bunker. My guys behind me were also firing. The 81st Division suffer around 260 dead capturing Angaur. Only 59 of the 1,400-strong Japanese garrison survive. With Marine casualties increasing on Peleliu, commanders pressure Rupertus to use the 81st Infantry Division units to replace Marines. He refuses, likely because of animosity between the Marine Corps and the Army. Over the following days, Marines continue to secure Peleliu, especially in the east. But the gains against Japanese troops in the mountains are still slow and come with considerable casualties. I picked up the rifle of a dead Marine and I went up the hill. I didn't worry about death anymore. I had resigned from the human race. In the next foxhole was a rifleman. He peered at me through red and painful eyes. I didn't care about him and he didn't care about me. As a fighting unit, the 1st Marines was finished. We were no longer human beings. I fired at anything that moved in front of me, friend or foe. I had no friends. I just wanted to kill. By D+6, 1st Marine casualties reach 1,749, 56%. The worst hit 1st Battalion suffers 71% losses, including all the original platoon leaders. Only following the intervention of Major General Geiger does Rupertus finally relieve them with the Army's 321st Regimental Combat Team. US Army troops secure a tenuous road along the west of the mountains and support securing northern Peleliu. Although the Japanese partly reinforced the defenders from other islands, by D12 only the Ammerbrogel pocket remains in Japanese hands. US forces now converge on the pocket they call Bloody Nose Ridge, where Japanese defenders concentrate on key features like the Horseshoe and Five Sisters. Once aerial reconnaissance reveals the nature of the obstacles, US troops shift to siege tactics to minimize American casualties. 5th Marines Commander Colonel Harold Harris claims, "I intend to be lavish with ammunition and stingy with men's lives." US troops use bulldozers, flamethrower LVTs, demolitions, white phosphorus, and thermite grenades. Captain Hunt describes the effects of these incendiary grenades during earlier fighting. Japanese soldiers caught fire and, screeching horribly, with the ammunition in their belts exploding like strings of firecrackers, ran into the water and rolled over and over, attempting to extinguish the flames which clung to them relentlessly. But that did no good, and they burned in the water. But American casualties remain high. Positions like the Five Sisters must be simultaneously attacked to prevent Japanese counterattacks, and US attempts regularly fail. As it dragged on, and the casualties mounted, a sense of despair pervaded us. It seemed that the only escape was to be killed or wounded. The will for self-preservation weakened. Many men I knew became intensely fatalistic. Somehow, though, one never could quite visualize his own death. It was always the next man. But getting wounded did seem inevitable. One couldn't hope to continue to escape the law of averages forever. By D+27, the Japanese pocket is about 700 by 450 meters. Nakagawa reports he has only 700 combat-exhausted troops remaining. Still, the Marines are also spent. On D+32, they're fully relieved by the 81st Infantry Division, with air support from the reopened airfield. High-explosive bombs are of limited use and risk friendly fire from coral fragments, so aircraft drop newly developed napalm. An Army engineer recalls. In a ridge on Peleliu, the Japs were holed up with rooms for living quarters. The planes dropped napalm bombs, and late that evening, the mortar battalion set off mortars and made the whole ridge blaze. They just went up, dropped, and ignited the napalm all along that ridge. Of course, through the crevices and the cracks in this ridge, it ran into their living quarters. You couldn't bomb them out. They were burned out. The air attacks are likely the shortest air combat mission of the war, roughly 15 seconds to the target location. Most pilots do not even bother to retract their landing gear. It takes army troops another 6 weeks to finish the job. On D+54, Nakagawa informs headquarters his men are through, and he asks to launch a suicidal Gyokusai attack. A Japanese soldier later recalled. Dying was easier than sticking it out. It took all our energy to live. Headquarters denies permission, and Nakagawa continues the resistance. Only on D+70 does Nakagawa radio his final message of Sakura, Sakura, signaling the end of the resistance. His last 56 troops conduct night infiltrations as he and Murai commit ritual suicide. Final mopping up operations continue until November 27th, D+73, although some Japanese soldiers continue to hold out, in one case until 1954. One survivor, who surrendered 3 years after the battle, summed up their time on Peleliu. The whole island was rock, rock, rock. It was horrible. The battles of Peleliu and Angaur cost around 10,500 US casualties, of which 2,000 are killed. Japanese losses are around 10,000, almost all killed. US forces capture 360 prisoners in the Palaus, mostly Korean or Okinawan laborers. The high US losses led to questions as to whether Peleliu was worth it. Rupertus was relieved of command and effectively demoted, but Nimitz has also been blamed for going ahead with the mission. Nimitz's defenders claim it secured MacArthur's flank for operations in the Philippines, removed the threat of Japanese air attack or reinforcement from Palau, eliminated veteran Japanese troops, and created new US air bases. They also argue it allowed the US to learn about new Japanese tactics. Critics, though, say air attacks from March 1944 effectively destroyed all Japanese aircraft and long-range shipping in the Palaus, isolating the garrison and securing MacArthur's flank that way. And the US bomber base on Angaur never contributed significantly to the Philippines operation. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison concluded, "It would take more arguments than this writer can muster to prove Peleliu was worth the cost. Admiral Halsey had the right idea. Palau should have been bypassed." With very few Japanese accounts of the battle, arguments regarding the value of the operation often only highlight the wasteful loss of American lives. But it's worth noting bypassing the Palau Islands would have also probably saved around 10,000 Japanese, as well as the traditional homes and ways of life of Palau Islanders. Also, if the US did learn from Peleliu, so did the Japanese. They replicate Nakagawa's defense on other islands, and the US experience of such tactics on Peleliu will not prevent even higher casualties in the next stages of the US island hopping campaign. By late 1944, US forces in the Pacific are within striking distance of the Japanese-occupied Philippines. The islands are vital for the Japanese as they provide war materials and a link to the oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. In summer, US commanders finally resolved their debates about where to attack and confirmed General Douglas MacArthur's plan for seizing the Filipino island of Mindanao before moving on to capture Leyte. MacArthur understands capturing Japanese-occupied islands will increase the pressure to also liberate the capital, Manila. For MacArthur, it's also about personal prestige, since he publicly promised to return to the Philippines after retreating in 1942. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Spruance transfers command to Admiral William Halsey, renaming 5th Fleet to 3rd Fleet. Supporting air attacks from Halsey's also renamed Task Force 38 eliminate around 500 Japanese land-based aircraft and reveal minimal enemy resistance in the Mindanao area. In early September, Halsey recommends bringing forward the Leyte invasion, originally scheduled for December, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff agree. However, the rapid shift in planning creates problems. The invasion fleet will be protected by the 7th Fleet's older battleships and light escort carriers. With the coming monsoon season preventing the use of land-based airfields, MacArthur insists Halsey's Task Force 38 provide additional air support. U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz agrees, but also orders Halsey to go over to the attack if an opportunity arises. In case opportunity for destruction of major portion of the enemy fleet is offered or can be created, such destruction becomes the primary task. MacArthur, who has vetoed direct communication between 3rd Fleet and his 7th Fleet, is unaware of this. Meanwhile, the Japanese are also developing their own strategy based around the Philippines. They call their plan Show 1 or Victory 1. Many Japanese commanders know the name is optimistic, since recent defeats have sapped Japanese naval strength, especially aircraft and experienced pilots. Still, they do have formidable Yamato-class battleships as well as destroyers capable of long-range torpedo attacks. But the Japanese combined fleet is dwarfed by the US 3rd and 7th Fleets, which have 34 fleet and escort carriers, while other considerations limit planning. Continued rivalry between the Japanese Army and Navy means that planning is mostly separate, despite Show 1's reliance on Army-controlled land-based aircraft. The Japanese expect the US to attack the Philippines, but they're not certain. So they develop separate plans for other islands like Formosa and station part of the combined fleet at Linga Roads. It's a secure location, but 2,500 kilometers from Leyte and 3,000 from Formosa. A lack of fuel at other bases means the Navy cannot refuel after departing Brunei, so it can only sail once it's sure of the US target. This means it'll take several days before the Japanese fleet will arrive, so it's unlikely to catch any invasion force during the landings. Despite these issues, attacking the US invasion fleet is still the objective. By October, Japanese Commander Admiral Soimu Toyoda is confident the US will target Leyte. He splits his combined fleet into 3 major formations. The 1st Diversionary Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and based around the 2 Yamato-class battleships is the strongest. Once the US attack begins, it will sail to the Leyte Gulf via the San Bernardino Strait and attack the invasion fleet from the north. Meanwhile, the 2nd Force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima will enter the Gulf from the south and is supported by a separate but attached force of older ships under Admiral Shoji Nishimura. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force, now called the Mobile Force Main Body, will support the attack. But they lack aircraft and experienced pilots, so the carriers hope to lure away Task Force 38 as a decoy. The plan is complex and depends on concentrating forces at a critical time. Similar coordinated plans have previously failed, and by the time the Japanese fleets arrive, it's understood most US forces will already be ashore with significant supplies. Most Japanese naval officers don't think it will work. And so by early October, both sides are focused on Leyte. However, the first major clash occurs in the air over Formosa. To further prepare the Leyte invasion, Task Force 38's carriers renew air attacks across the region, concentrating on Formosa from October 12th. US carriers launch around 1,370 sorties and destroy over 100 Japanese aircraft by the end of the day. Air Commander Shigeru Fukudome laments, "Our fighters were nothing but so many eggs thrown at the stone wall of the indomitable enemy formation." Fukudome is reluctant to commit more planes to the fight, but receives orders for a decisive air battle. The Japanese throw aircraft assigned to the show operations into the growing battle, giving Fukudome around 860 immediately operational aircraft. This should be enough to match Task Force 38's 1,000 planes, but Japanese pilots have very little experience. Japanese command expects these pilots to break through to attack US vessels, while large, mixed groups of aircraft occupy US fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Radar operator Mike Carney notes a wave of 75 to 100 aircraft. The CAP pilots began to report a great many different kinds of planes. In other words, this was not a homogeneous, well-integrated tactical outfit, but it was very much a heterogeneous air mob coming up there, composed of all kinds of damn things. In the ensuing melee, the Americans shoot down or chase away most Japanese aircraft. However, Japanese torpedoes strike and badly damage the heavy cruisers USS Canberra and USS Houston. These modest Japanese achievements come at a significant cost. Between October 10th and 17th, Japan loses around 500 aircraft to 89 US aircraft, although initially the Japanese believe they've sunk up to 17 US ships. Toyoda orders Shima's force to mop up the remnants. The US encourages him by using the crippled cruisers as bait, and although Shima cautiously approaches, he soon withdraws. Almost immediately after the Formosa battle, MacArthur's amphibious force heads for Leyte on October 17th. Toyoda implements Show 1 and plans to reach Leyte Gulf by October 24th. It quickly becomes clear the Japanese timetable is untenable. Kurita's refueling in Brunei is delayed, submarines need 48 hours to prepare, and Ozawa needs to relocate air crews and load aircraft onto his carriers with cranes due to the pilot's lack of carrier landing experience. Kurita's force is split into two and aims to attack the Leyte Gulf in a pincer movement, while Shima's force will sail south from Japan and also enter via the Surigao Strait. The plan is not popular among Kurita's officers. The rescheduling means they will attack during the day, not at night as they had trained for, and they will miss the opportunity to attack the invasion fleet. Kurita pleads with his officers. You must all remember that there are such things as miracles. What man can say that there is no chance for our fleet to turn the tide of war in a decisive battle? We shall have a chance to meet our enemies. We shall engage his task forces. I hope you will not carry your responsibilities lightly. I know you will act faithfully and well. Kurita orders his ships towards Leyte via the Palawan Passage, an area of known US submarine activity, in order to save limited fuel. Kurita's fleet lacks anti-submarine equipment and does not deploy the destroyers as an anti-submarine screen. On October 23rd, 2 US submarines sink 2 heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship, and heavily damage a third. But the Japanese also score a success. The remnants of Formosa's Second Air Fleet relocate to the Philippines and support Kurita. Japanese losses remain high, and few planes mount attacks. However, a single 550-pound bomb pierces the deck of carrier USS Princeton and explodes in the hangar, causing additional explosions. As the light cruiser USS Birmingham and other ships help fight the fires, the Princeton's torpedo magazine explodes, killing and wounding 650 sailors on the Birmingham and sealing Princeton's fate. US sailors scuttle it shortly afterwards. The Japanese success is partly due to luck, but also the spread-out nature of Task Force 38. Of its 4 task groups, 2 are on their way for leave, 1 is patrolling east of Luzon, and 1 is blocking the San Bernardino Strait. Halsey recalls all task groups, but some are too far away to play a role on October 24th. This means when Kurita's force approaches Leyte Gulf via the Sibuyan Sea, only Task Group 38.2, the weakest task group with only 1 fleet and 2 escort carriers, can intercept. Admiral Gerald Bogan orders US pilots to focus attacks on heavy battleships Yamato and Musashi. The first attacks, US Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats hit Musashi with multiple bombs and at least 7 torpedoes, which causes severe flooding. But Japanese damage control keeps her in the fight. The Musashi's crew claimed to down 6 US planes with heavy anti-aircraft fire, including from their main 18.1-inch guns. I felt the muzzle blast each time they fired. I could swear the wings were ready to fold every time these huge shockwaves hit us. Some of the explosions were blue, some red, some were pink, and some were yellow. The severely damaged Musashi withdraws to the west with 2 escorts, but American planes continually attack. By 7 p.m., Musashi has been hit by at least 16 bombs and 11 torpedoes, and sinks with 1,000 of her 2,400 crew. In the entire war, Musashi never fires a shot in anger at another ship. Kurita temporarily orders a withdrawal to the west, but later continues his journey towards the Leyte Gulf. US planes only observe his initial withdrawal and believe the first diversionary force is out of the fight. Exaggerated reports of damage to Kurita's force reinforce this false impression. But by concentrating attacks on the Musashi, the Americans leave most Japanese ships undamaged, although one damaged heavy cruiser also withdraws. While US aircraft attack in the Sibuyan Sea, another battle is taking place to the south. US planes spot Nishimura's 3rd section en route to Leyte Gulf in the afternoon, which gives 7th Fleet plenty of time to react. Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf sets up an ambush in the Surigao Strait. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and up to 24 destroyers and 40 torpedo boats wait at various distances to engage the Japanese force. Opening US torpedo attacks sink 2 destroyers and the battleship Fuso before ships engage in the last battleship gunnery duel in history, in which US firepower dominates. I was receiving a terrific bombardment. There were so many near misses that the gyro compass was out. The ship was constantly trembling from the force of near misses and the wireless was out. But torpedoes again inflict the most damage on the Japanese force and finish off the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. For a moment, it appears Shima is coming to Nishimura's aid, but on seeing the one-sided battle, he decides against it. US forces half-heartedly pursue Shima, but luckily for them, as it turns out, eventually abandon the chase. At 4 p.m. on October 24th, Task Force 38 detects Ozawa's carriers. Admiral Halsey now faces a dilemma. He can continue to defend the San Bernardino Strait against Kurita's weakened force, or move north to eliminate Ozawa's carriers. Crucially, with the resources available to Task Force 38, he could potentially do both, but US doctrine isn't for fighting 2 battles at once. Halsey decides to move the entire task force north to catch the Japanese carriers, which had escaped destruction at the previous Battle of the Philippine Sea. An overloaded radio net and confusing chain of command means this is not clearly communicated to all, including Admiral Thomas Kincaid of 7th Fleet, whose surface warships are far to the south after the Battle of Surigao Strait. He assumes Halsey's battleships remain at the San Bernardino Strait in the north, and only finds out the truth too late. By this point, Kurita's force has slipped through the strait and is moving south along the coast off Samar. At 6:47 a.m., they spot the lightly armored escort carriers of 7th Fleet's Taffy 3. Both fleets are equally surprised, as one US sailor notes. I ran to the bridge and looked out, and I saw what looked like toothpicks on the horizon. Right across the horizon. Many, many ships. The Japanese are currently shifting into a daytime anti-aircraft formation, limiting their ability to respond. Still, within 15 minutes, they open fire. Kurita believes he is facing heavier American fleet carriers and wants to smash their decks before they can launch aircraft, so his attack is rushed and uncoordinated. This is the first time a Japanese surface ship has ever fired on a US carrier. Meanwhile, Taffy 3 commander Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague reacts decisively. He orders his carriers to sail east to increase their distance from Kurita and turn them into the wind, which helps launching aircraft. He orders all planes, even unarmed ones, into the air, and ships lay thick smoke screens. The humidity means smoke screens linger on the water, increasing their effectiveness, while rain squalls provide temporary concealment. Aircraft from nearby Taffy 2 scramble to help Taffy 3. Even so, the Japanese continue their pursuit, with the Yamato's 18-inch guns opening fire from 27 kilometers away. Although she doesn't score a direct hit, near misses from the huge projectiles damage ships by exploding underwater. Captain of the USS White Plains recalled a salvo. The vessel was shaken and twisted violently, throwing personnel in some parts of the ship from their feet and much gear to the deck from normal horizontal storage. Many Japanese shells have been mixed with dye to create colorful shell splashes to help Japanese gunnery. As shells start to fall uncomfortably close, Sprague orders 3 destroyers to charge the Japanese. The US destroyers are completely outmatched, but the attack scores a torpedo hit on a Japanese cruiser and knocks it out of the battle. But other torpedoes miss, and the destroyers come under heavy Japanese fire. Yamato's smaller shells hit the USS Johnston 3 times before the American ship manages to hide in a rain squall. USS Hull, however, is hit up to 23 times and sinks with most of her crew. As Kuritas sends forward his own destroyers, USS Johnston attacks again, forcing the Japanese destroyers to launch torpedoes from an unfavorable position and score no hits. However, Japanese fire now focuses on Johnston, which soon sinks. Tadashi Okuno, aboard one of the Japanese destroyers, recalls. Men were floating on the water's surface or sinking beneath it, while half-naked crew members jammed themselves into lifeboats and rowed away, escaping. We were close enough to see their unkempt beards and the tattoos on their arms. One of our machine gunners impulsively pulled his trigger. He must have been overflowing with feelings of animosity towards the enemy. But it was checked by a loud voice from the bridge, saying, "Don't shoot at escaping men. Stop shooting. Stop." US air attacks, torpedoes, and harassing destroyers hinder Japanese gunnery against the fleeing carriers. Even when Japanese shells do hit, the US carriers are so lightly armored that armor-piercing shells sometimes pass through without exploding. Still, the carriers are taking damage. Yamato indirectly hits USS Gambia Bay, forcing it to fall behind and take fire from other Japanese ships. It eventually capsizes and sinks. But the Japanese also lose vessels. Even though US pilots launch attacks in an improvised manner, they remain a major distraction and contribute to the sinking of 3 Japanese cruisers and damage many more. These attacks, combined with Kurita's continuing belief that he's facing a much stronger fleet carrier force, result in a controversial command decision. Just as damage is starting to mount against Taffy 3, Kurita calls off the pursuit and withdraws through the San Bernardino Strait. But Taffy 3 is not safe yet. Shortly after Kurita's withdrawal, a wave of kamikazes attack the carriers, sinking USS St. Lo. This new, desperate Japanese tactic first emerges in the battles of the Philippines. We talked to military aviation historian Christoph Bergs about the first kamikaze attacks.
Thanks, Jesse. In 1944, kamikaze attacks were not new. For example, during the action of Bougainville in February 1942, Lieutenant Masayoshi Nakagawa tried to steer his damaged aircraft right into USS Lexington. Similar spontaneous incidents happened throughout the war by pilots on all sides. Japanese pilots may have done it more often, usually when they knew that their plane was so damaged that they would never make it back to base, but they were not unique in this case. However, by October 1944, it started to be different. Japan started to adopt suicide attacks as a standardized tactic in both the Army and the Navy's air services. Various commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Takashige Igusa, Lieutenant Colonel Koji Tanaka, Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima, and Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi are typically considered as the fathers of kamikaze. In fact, Arima died on October 15th, reportedly after trying to ram CV-13, the USS Franklin. Onishi, although he was initially opposed to kamikaze, then used Arima's attack to start ordering Japanese squadrons to commit suicide attacks in the Philippines. And the reason for this was a simple cost-benefit analysis. The Japanese air units in the Philippines were under intense pressure, and it was unlikely that they would hold out for long before everything was lost in those islands. So when Onishi toured the first units, he frankly explained to them that they were going to die soon anyway, and kamikaze gave them a chance to inflict higher losses. And soon, the first kamikaze attacks were ordered against Allied ships. These attacks surprised the Allies during the Philippines campaign. The success of kamikaze may have even surprised the Japanese. One calculation by the Allies on this early period indicates that kamikaze attacks had a 10 times better chance of scoring a hit than conventional air attacks with bombs. Next to sinking or damaging about 40 ships in the area, 7 carriers were also hit. One of them, the aforementioned USS St. Lo, sank. But October 1944 was merely the beginning. Based on the early success during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the kamikaze program was drastically expanded as the sun started to set for Imperial Japan. Special attack units were formed for suicide attacks, although not actually every kamikaze pilot was formally part of such a unit. Japan increased the numbers of identified suicide attacks between 1944 to 1945 by about 60%. For example, as the Allies then started to close in on Okinawa between April and May 1945, Japan flew more kamikaze attacks during that period than during the whole of October 1944 to March 1945. However, it still only achieved the same number of hits, showing that kamikaze was now starting to be far less effective even though more planes were being sent. And this is because the Allies adapted to these Japanese attacks. One of the most famous countermeasures was the VT, or variable time fuse. Its name was basically a security cover. The V2 fuse was not your typical time-delayed fuse that explodes in those famous black puffs along the path of a bomber. Instead, it had a small proximity sensor. By transmitting a signal and receiving a return, the shell could then sense if a plane was close and explode at the optimal point. Between October 1944 to March 1945, if a plane came into the range of ship-based AA, Japan had about 73% chance of a hit or a near miss on that ship. But between April and May 1945, this dropped to 43%, and these numbers are dropping even further as we go into the final months. And this strongly suggests that the improvements to AA and fire control had a significant effect on Japanese kamikaze attacks. However, early warning and fighter planes were equally important, maybe even more so. With radar and fighters, the Allies could intercept Japanese attacks long before they started to reach the task force and got into AA range. For this, radar, radio communications and a clear command and control system was needed. And by placing radar-equipped destroyer pickets at some distance from the task force, kamikaze attacks were identified very early and fighters were then vectored to intercept. Statistically, if a plane was intercepted about 10 miles out from a ship, the chance for that kamikaze plane to reach said ship was still about 50%. But if it was intercepted at 50 miles, this chance dropped to about 2%. This is why only about a third of all kamikaze attacks ever got close to a task force. Early warning and fighter vectoring proved to be the best countermeasure against Japanese attacks, and the augmented AA defenses were an effective backstop. Now, because of the early attacks, carriers are typically considered as the main target for kamikaze pilots. However, the majority of hits were actually scored against auxiliary vessels, like transports, large landing ships, or destroyer pickets. It was exactly these pickets that had that important early warning radar. They were the first ships that Japanese pilots usually saw en route, and that they were just targeted straight away, because the pilots that were being sent out had really minimal flight and target recognition training. About 170 hits were scored on destroyers and auxiliary vessels, compared to about 25 hits against carriers. By the war's end, close to 4,000 Japanese pilots are said to have been sent out as part of this last desperate measure. Kamikaze pilots scored about 450 hits or near misses, sinking 66 Allied ships and having damaged a few hundred. Allied casualties include 6,200 killed and about 8,700 wounded. Now, even though Japan had a lot of tactical success early on, operationally and strategically, kamikaze did not shift the balance in the Pacific. And with that, thanks Jesse, and back to you at Real Time History.
Some historians have since suggested Kurita could have pushed through into the Leyte Gulf and achieved Show 1's objectives by attacking the US invasion fleet. But this has been hotly debated. Kurita will later give various justifications for his decision, including mental fatigue, fear of air attack, fuel concerns, and awareness the only US targets left in the Gulf were likely to be empty transports. Some Japanese officers, like Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, argued Kurita ultimately wanted to go down fighting against US warships, not attacking empty transports. Under these circumstances, it was presumed that if our force did succeed in entering Leyte Gulf, we would find that transport had already withdrawn. and any success we might achieve would be very minor at best. We were prepared to fight to the last man, but we wanted to die gloriously. We were convinced that several enemy carrier groups were disposed nearby and that we were surrounded. Our shore-based air force had been rather inactive, but if they could only strike a successful blow, we might still achieve a decisive fleet engagement. And even if we were destroyed in such a battle, death would be glorious. Furthermore, Kurita was unaware Ozawa had successfully lured away Task Force 38. But even if Kurita did storm the Gulf, stronger US forces could respond. As Kurita withdraws, Halsey moves against Ozawa's diversionary force off Cape Enganyao. The US sees the Japanese carriers as a major threat, since the Americans are unaware most of the Japanese carrier planes have already been destroyed. Task Force 38 opens its attack in the early hours of October 25th, focusing on Ozawa's 1 fleet and 3 light carriers. Ozawa is only able to launch 13 planes in defense. Bill Davis, flying a Hellcat from the Lexington, describes an attack run. After my dive, I was perhaps 3 feet from the windows on the bridge and could see the Japanese officers and enlisted men commanding the ship. There was an admiral in dress whites, complete with sword. I was going 530 miles an hour, and I only got a glimpse, but that image is impressed on my mind forever. In a well-coordinated attack, US planes hit the Zuikaku with armor-piercing bombs and 6 torpedoes. Listing 21 degrees, the crew assembles on the flight deck where the captain gives a final address and the crew lowers the ensign. Only then does the captain order the crew to abandon ship, and she sinks shortly afterwards. By the afternoon, US planes sink 1 destroyer and 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, crippling the 4th. But despite launching the largest carrier air attack of the war with 527 sorties, the final results are slightly disappointing for the Americans. Japanese maneuvering and heavy anti-aircraft fire limit US accuracy, and pilot fatigue sets in. When desperate calls for reinforcement reach Halsey from 7th Fleet further south, he's unable to finish the battle with his fast battleships. After turning around, his ships then also move too slowly to catch Kurita's force, although they do sink a straggling destroyer. The battle off Cape Enganyao marks the end of major combat operations in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The battle's scale and the fact that it happens in parallel to the land battles for Leyte mean historians struggle to define where and when it starts and finishes, which means casualty figures also vary. US naval casualties are often listed as 473 killed, 1,110 missing, and 1,220 wounded. These numbers do not include an additional 1,750 American POWs killed when a US submarine sinks the Japanese prisoner ship Arisan Maru on October 24th. Japanese losses are around 13,000 killed. In terms of ships, the US lose 11 of the 300 ships involved in the battle, while the Japanese lose 28 of 69 ships assigned to Show 1. On the surface, the Battle of Leyte Gulf seems like a major US victory, but some have questioned whether the US could have achieved even more with fewer losses. Many observers point to Admiral Halsey's conduct and personality. His critics accuse him of blindly taking the Japanese bait and giving the Japanese their only reasonable chance of success in the Leyte Gulf, even though some of his intelligence officers advised against it. Although Halsey was popular with the public, he had strained relationships with his superiors and colleagues. He likely knew his career was waning compared to others like Admirals Raymond Spruance and Mark Mitcher, and perhaps sought a decisive victory to improve his standing at the expense of defending the Gulf. His defenders argue it's unfair to judge Halsey on information known only after the battle, and add that Nimitz had ordered him to concentrate on carriers if they revealed themselves. US intelligence regarding Japanese positions and overall strategy was poor, and communications were unreliable. When Halsey headed north, he believed Kurita's force was decimated and posed no serious threat. As it seemed childish to me to guard statically San Bernardino Strait, I concentrated TF-38 during the night and steamed north to attack the Japanese carriers at dawn. I believed that Kurita's force had been so heavily damaged in the Sibuyan Sea that it could no longer be considered a serious menace to 7th Fleet. The whole US force also struggled with a convoluted and fragmented command structure as a result of coordinating two previously separate commands and managing the egos of commanders like MacArthur and Halsey. Even so, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a clear US victory, and Japanese commanders like Admiral Matome Ugaki admit it. The enemy cleaned up the sea thoroughly, leaving nothing, with the feeling of a victor disposing of the remnant of the defeated enemy. We also had times like that some time ago. The defeat did not come as a surprise for many Japanese naval officers. Confidence in Show 1 was low before the battle, and historians have since argued the Japanese strategy had no chance of success, even if everything went according to plan. Some commanders attempted to frame the battle as dying with honor. Please give the combined fleet the chance to bloom as flowers of death. This is the Navy's earnest request. But even this goal was almost impossible. The Japanese fleets departed so late there was no chance of catching the US invasion armada during the landings. The best Japanese commanders could hope for were empty transports or obsolete invasion escort vessels, hardly worth the loss of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The idea of a decisive battle against the US was a leftover of pre-war thinking and ignored the vast disparity in strength, especially naval air power. Kurita may have had a chance to attack into the Gulf following his engagement with Taffy III, but he lacked any means to influence the battle on land, which was the objective of Show 1 in the first place. Still, defeat at sea did not automatically lead to the fall of the Philippines. As the naval battle raged, so did MacArthur's land campaign to finally fulfill his 1942 promise. But the liberation of the Philippines from Japanese control would be a long, bitter, and costly fight. On October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur wades ashore on the Philippine island of Leyte beside Filipino President Sergio Osmeña. For MacArthur, it's a momentous moment after the Japanese invasion forced him to leave the islands in 1942. US media published the images of him trudging ashore to symbolize his dramatic return, even though he was initially angry that there was no landing boat. While he takes those famous steps, US forces, who landed just hours before, push inland against weak Japanese resistance. MacArthur gives a radio broadcast from the beach. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated by the blood of our two people. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives and restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people. But the battle for the Philippines is far from over. MacArthur expects to capture Leyte and its valuable airfields relatively quickly. From Leyte, US forces can invade Luzon and take Manila and Clark Field, one of only 2 airfields in the Philippines suitable for heavy bombers. Although MacArthur is thinking of his own prestige, he also wants his Southwest Pacific area to contribute more directly to operations against remaining Japanese positions in the Asia-Pacific theater, especially by exporting air power. But poor weather and Japanese actions ruin MacArthur's plan. US 6th Army under General Walter Kruger advanced slowly as Japanese aircraft contest air superiority and Japanese reinforcements land from other islands. Japanese commander General Tomoyuki Yamashita, recently arrived from Manchuria, is known as the Tiger of Malaya for his capture of Singapore in 1942, but he is not enthusiastic about his new posting. So it's come at last, has it? Well, my going won't change anything. It's my turn to die, isn't it? Yamashita hoped to fight the decisive battle on Luzon, but his superiors pressure him to fight on Leyte. As reinforcements arrive from other islands, he contests the rugged mountain areas. But by early December, Japanese strength is waning. A Japanese airborne counterattack against US airfields fails, and a US landing captures Yamashita's resupply port at Ormoc. He retreats to Luzon with just 1,000 men. Roughly 20,000 Japanese troops remain on Leyte and harass US troops for 4 more months, despite MacArthur announcing the island secure on December 25, 1944. Private Saito is one of 439 Japanese who later surrender. To lose one's life in a war of this kind is truly regrettable. My hatred for the army hierarchy is stronger than I can express. I must survive and tell this story to the Japanese people, or my soul will never rest. The things we did in China are being done to us. Japan will soon be defeated. From the outset, I never thought that we could win. The Leyte landing required more troops than US planners expected, but it does provide a jumping-off point for Luzon. On December 15th, US forces capture Mindoro to support the attack, and soon after MacArthur views Bataan and Corregidor from offshore, the sites of the final US defeat in 1942. I felt an indescribable sense of loss, of sorrow, of loneliness, and of solemn consecration. Yamashita is fatalistic about holding Manila. He considers making it an open city, as MacArthur had in 1941, and focuses defense in the northern mountains. Still, Luzon has roughly 260,000 Japanese troops in 3 commands. Many, however, are hastily armed non-combat personnel who lack vehicles and communications equipment. MacArthur believes the Japanese are weak and orders Kruger to conduct a lightning campaign from Lingayen Gulf towards Clark Field and Manila. He cites figures from his intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby, who claims there are only 152,000 Japanese troops on Luzon. But Kruger wants to conduct a cautious series of operations and is skeptical of Willoughby's estimate. 6th Army lands at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, and much like on Leyte, resistance is minimal. Within days, 150,000 US troops are ashore. They push inland, aided by Filipino guerrillas, who act as scouts and combat troops. As Kruger moves, the biggest threat is kamikaze attacks on the invasion armada. However, after several days, these abruptly end as Japanese air losses mount. Kruger advances towards Manila cautiously, repelling a Japanese armored counterattack. He's concerned about both a flanking attack from his east and being lured into a Japanese trap. The lack of initial resistance is perplexing for some. I still cannot make up my mind whether the Japanese are being stupid or rather bright. MacArthur pressures Kruger to advance faster, but terrain is poor for a rapid push, with 217 destroyed bridges on the way to Manila, although Kruger likely does overestimate Japanese ability to counterattack. As 6th Army closes on Clark Field and nearby Fort Stotzenburg in late January, MacArthur prematurely announces it secure. 14 Corps Commander Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold complains. Japs hold Stotzenburg in strength, though General MacArthur has already announced its capture. Why does he do this? It takes the Americans 5 days to capture the airfield and a further 3 weeks to clear the surrounding area. The remaining Japanese withdraw into the mountains. As they close on Manila, the 37th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions form 2 flying columns, mechanized assault groups of truck-mounted infantry, tanks, and mobile artillery. Their orders are to rush for Manila, and photographer Carle Maidens rides with them. Sometimes we rode on highways, and sometimes we bounced and trundled along in fields and carabao trails. Almost all the bridges were out, and we forded the rivers, men holding their weapons high and often wading up to their chests in the water, while the trucks and lumbering tanks pushed and pulled each other with engines screaming and water flying. In late January 1945, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army also joins the battle, landing at San Antonio and Nasugbu. The southern landing is officially a reconnaissance in force, but MacArthur gives Eichelberger permission to push to Manila if possible. This is your only chance to take part in the capture of Manila, Bob. You can be the Patton of the Pacific. The 11th Airborne advance aggressively, causing the Japanese to overestimate American strength. On February 3rd, US paratroopers jump onto Tagaytay Ridge overlooking the road to Manila. Only a third land on target, but after regrouping with the aid of Filipino civilians, they secure the ridge by the end of the day. There's another reason for MacArthur's urgency. As US forces advance, they near Japanese POW and internment camps, which hold military and civilian prisoners since 1941 and 42. Liberating them is vital, but US forces need to be careful. On Palawan in December 1944, Japanese guards killed prisoners as US forces approached, including by burning them alive. In April 1942, the Japanese captured about 11,000 US and 60,000 Filipinos. By late 1944, around 7,000 US prisoners of war remain in camps across the Philippines. By January 1945, the Japanese remove many on so-called hell ships, leaving behind only the weakest. Japan also interns 7,800 Allied civilians, with over 3,000 at the Santo Tomas camp in Manila. Camp conditions are terrible, with poor sanitation and starvation. Yamashita later claims he ordered prisoners released, but this rarely happens. In some cases, like at the Cabanatuan POW camp, Japanese guards release prisoners, but tell them that if they leave, they'll be considered combatants and shot. So they stay in the camp. Opportunities to liberate camps do arise. US Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas liberate Cabanatuan camp and its 500 prisoners in a daring raid. The raiders distract Japanese guards with an aircraft, then rush in, kill the guards, and free the prisoners. In many cases, prisoners are too weak to walk. Some do not even recognize US troops in their new equipment. I'll never forget the bewildered look on these men. They could not believe they'd been released. Our equipment, everything we had, helmets and everything else, were so foreign to them. They just thought we were men from Mars. By early February, the flying columns reach Manila's northern outskirts and liberate the Bilibid POW and Santo Tomas internment camps. At Santo Tomas, US officers negotiate for Commandant Toshio Hayashi to leave with his troops after he takes 200 prisoners hostage. Rupert Wilkinson, then 8 years old, recalls the guards' departure. Some Santo Tomas residents jeered, but GIs shushed them. Our old jailers maintained order for a few blocks, but once their American escorts turned back toward the campus, the former guards broke ranks and scattered, as a mortified Hayashi angrily tried to rein them in. As the 37th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions probe Manila, MacArthur again makes an optimistic statement about imminent liberation. He still hopes to capture Manila intact and even prepares a victory parade. But the fight for Manila would not go according to MacArthur's plans, nor to Yamashita's. In early 1945, Yamashita ordered Manila abandoned. However, Manila Naval Defense Force Commander Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi remains in the city, and historians debate his intentions. Some claim he wants to fight to the death in Manila to redeem himself after losing his battleship command in 1942. Others argue he refuses to follow an army general's orders, or is simply unable to withdraw due to communication problems, lack of vehicles, and the need to destroy dock facilities. In any case, Iwabuchi prepares for battle. He has around 12,500 sailors and 4,000 army troops in Manila. Most lack combat experience, but are well equipped with munitions, artillery, and automatic weapons stripped from aircraft and warships. Iwabuchi mostly reinforces south of the Pasig River in Manila, as he originally believed the US would land to the south. In the city center, Japanese troops reinforce select buildings, including the Rizal Memorial Stadium, Post Office, City Hall, Provisor Island Power Plant, and earthquake-resistant government buildings and hotels. They also defend major intersections with camouflaged pillboxes, naval mines, automatic weapons, and obstacles. Within buildings, Japanese troops construct hardpoints, including crenellated barricades with space for throwing grenades. Locals like Pasita Pestaño Jacinto worry about the Japanese demolitions and preparations. Defeat is a bitter pill that the Japanese cannot swallow. Defeat is the one thing that can make them turn into beasts. As US forces approach, Japanese troops torch city districts and commit atrocities against the Filipino population. Troops force civilians into public buildings under the guise of providing shelter, only to attack them with grenades or burn them alive. To justify the slaughter, Iwabuchi classes all Filipinos as guerrillas, as a Japanese soldier's diary reveals. February 7, 1945. 150 guerrillas were disposed of tonight. I personally stabbed and killed 10. February 9th. Burned 1,000 guerrillas to death tonight. February 13th. Enemy tanks are lurking in the vicinity of the Banzai Bridge. Our attack preparation has been completed. I am now on guard duty at guerrilla internment camp. While I was on duty, 10 guerrillas tried to escape. They were stabbed to death. At 1600 hours, all guerrillas were burned to death. Practically all those the Japanese kill are regular civilians. Japanese troops even bayonet children in front of their parents and often mutilate the bodies after death. Japanese troops also take young women, especially those with lighter complexions, to the Bayview Hotel, where the soldiers repeatedly rape them. Luisa Guevara is one of those women. Every night was the same. The Japanese would take girls all night long. I lost track of what was going on. I thought we were all going to be killed. As Griswold's troops fight through the suburbs, he requests air support, but MacArthur refuses to allow bombing and only reluctantly allows artillery. Griswold complains. MacArthur has visions of saving this beautiful city intact. He does not realize, as I do, that the skies burn red every night as the Japanese systematically sack the city. Nor does he know that enemy rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire are steadily increasing in intensity. My private opinion is that the Japs will hold part of Manila south of the Pasig River until all are killed. As 6th Army grinds forward in northern Manila, the 11th Airborne makes advances to the south. After clearing the Tagaytay Ridge, the paratroopers approach Iwabuchi's prepared positions between Nichols Field and Fort McKinley, known as the Genko Line. The line consists of 1,200 pillbox and fortified buildings and continues for 5.5 kilometers towards Manila. On Nichols Field, Japanese sailors position naval and anti-aircraft guns, including 120mm guns now used in an anti-tank role. The paratroopers lack the heavy weapons or artillery necessary to break through, ending Eichelberger's hope of a rapid drive to Manila. On February 10th, 11th Airborne is transferred to 6th Army for more artillery support, while the 1st Cavalry Division flanks Manila to support the attack on Fort McKinley. On February 13th, US troops capture Nichols Airfield, and the US increases their momentum in the south. 11th Airborne officer Edward Flanagan reports on his entry into Manila. Houses and shops flanking both sides of the highway which leads to the heart of the city were torn up by both Jap and American artillery. Tin-roofed houses looked as though a giant can opener had sliced through them, while once pretentious mansions gauntly displayed charred chimneys and trash piles of rubble. By this point, 37th Division to the north has captured the Provisor Island power plant and crossed the Pasig River in assault boats. The Americans now surround Japanese forces in Manila, in the government district and 16th century Spanish walled city of Intramuros. US forces, though, are untrained in urban combat and continue to struggle. Manila's wide boulevards limit cover, and reinforced buildings withstand bombardment. US troops developed improvised assault squads consisting of flamethrowers, automatic riflemen, demolition specialists, and bazookas. These teams saturate doors and windows with fire before assaulting. According to the diary of a Japanese Navy lieutenant, Iwabuchi orders his men to fight to the end. If we run out of bullets, we will use grenades. If we run out of grenades, we will cut down the enemy with swords. If we break our sword, we will kill them by sinking our teeth deep in their throats. US troops clear the Rizal Stadium in heavy fighting, while elsewhere heavy artillery pounds reinforced buildings from as little as 100 meters away. Hundreds of 155mm shells are fired at individual buildings, collapsing some and opening breaches for assault. After 16 days of fighting, only Intramuros holds out. US commanders mass their artillery for the final assault. They identify the northern wall, protected by the river, as the weakest defended point in the Japanese line. With walls up to 6 meters thick, US artillery batter them with unfused rounds. The high explosive shells burrow into the masonry and are later detonated by fused shells. On February 23rd, US guns fire 7,900 shells in just 1 hour. As the 129th Infantry Regiment crosses the river and the 145th Regiment advances on foot, American gunners fire smoke shells into Japanese-occupied buildings to blind the defenders. US troops storm through the breaches, and the Japanese withdraw to Fort Santiago. Fearing high casualties, US soldiers pump gasoline into tunnels and then light it on fire. The 37th Infantry Division reports on the tactic. Every thinkable method was employed, including gasoline and oil. It was effective, for when things cooled and men entered these chambers, Japs were found piled high, having suffered just as horrible a death as they inflicted on the thousands of innocent civilians they massacred. The Japanese keep hostages in Fort Santiago, and US soldiers again find evidence of atrocities, including rooms stacked with bayoneted and shot victims, and others starved to death in sealed-off tunnels. US soldiers reduced Japanese resistance by nightfall, although defenders in the legislative, agricultural, and finance buildings hold out for another 5 days. Iwabuchi likely commits suicide in the agricultural building on February 25th. On March 3rd, MacArthur announces Manila secure. In the Battle of Manila, the largest urban battle of the Pacific War, US losses are 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded, almost half from the 37th Division. Around 14,000 Japanese are killed, while 3,000 escape the city. Civilian losses are estimated at around 100,000, approximately 10% of the pre-battle population. One post-war estimate suggests 60% are killed by the Japanese and 40% unintentionally by US fire, but these statistics are debated. MacArthur fails to save the city he hoped to capture without a fight, and laments the high casualties as well as the destruction of his former suite at the Manila Hotel. MacArthur's staff member, General Bonner Fellers, writes to his wife, "The long, drawn-out battle was caused by a rather futile effort to save Manila and the civilian population. If anything should happen to Tokyo, the Japanese have asked for it." But the Philippines are still not completely under US control. Yamashita continues to resist according to his attritional strategy. Still, the Philippines operation is an American strategic success. The Filipino government is in Manila, major airfields captured, and the bulk of organized Japanese forces destroyed. MacArthur continues operations against Yamashita, including with the help of Filipino guerrillas, often fighting as regular infantry. By May 3rd, US forces secure Bataan and Corregidor, important symbolic targets after their loss in 1942. MacArthur launches additional landings on Palawan, Mindanao, and the Visayan Islands and pushes Yamashita's remaining troops towards Bontoc on Luzon. For Japanese holdouts, survival becomes the absolute priority. Then I had the news that an officer of another unit was eaten by his orderly as soon as he breathed his last. I believe the officer was so devoted to his orderly that he bequeathed him his body. This loyal servant fulfilled his lord and master's final wishes by burying him in his belly instead of the earth. Fighting continues on Luzon until the Japanese emperor broadcasts his intent to surrender on August 15, 1945. Yamashita eventually surrenders and is later tried for his role in the Japanese atrocities. Although he argues he never personally ordered the reprisals, a military court sentences him to death and executes him. In his last statement, he writes, "The time has come to atone for my guilt with my death. However, I do not think that all the crimes for which I am responsible can be easily liquidated simply by my death. Various indelible stains that I left on the history of mankind cannot be offset by the mechanical termination of my life." The US landings in the Philippines result in around 16,200 US dead and 47,000 wounded. Japanese casualty estimates vary, with the highest claiming 500,000 killed, the majority from disease and starvation. This would potentially constitute 1/5 of all Japanese losses in the Pacific. Throughout the war, about 1 million Filipino civilians and 33,000 guerrillas are killed, with casualties spiking towards the end of the occupation. The high losses mean some historians argue the Philippines should have been bypassed. Others suggest MacArthur's ego and unrealistic desire to capture Manila intact drove up casualties with his refusal to allow supporting heavy weapons while simultaneously demanding rapid advances. His defenders, however, highlight that these limitations came not from desires of personal prestige, but genuine concern for non-combatants, especially Filipinos, POWs, and civilian internees. MacArthur viewed the Allied return to the Philippines as something akin to the rescue of a beloved family member, an almost mystical moment of redemption and fellowship. Seldom in American military history has a general felt such a messianic sense of mission and so tight a bond with those whom he sought to liberate. Regardless of MacArthur's motivations, capturing the Philippines will break open a central Japanese position in the Pacific. The country is an ally under occupation. The islands house major airfields and provide vital war materials. They're also a Japanese logistics hub for the Burma, India, and Chinese theaters. Since the Japanese invasion in 1937, fighting in China has mostly bogged down into stalemate. Japan maintains significant forces in China, captures many major cities, and still makes limited advances. But the fragmented nature of China politically means none fundamentally compel Chinese nationalist Chiang Kai-shek to sue for peace. Widespread Japanese atrocities also galvanized Chinese resistance and international sympathy. Instead, Chiang's forces withdraw to the Chinese hinterland, where Japanese forces, who are tied to their coastal and railway supply routes, cannot freely go. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong's Chinese communists also oppose Japanese forces, although in practice they do little fighting. As Japan gets stuck in China, the US sends aircraft and vast amounts of equipment to Chiang Kai-shek. However, Washington's relationship with Chiang is poor, and US commanders are skeptical of Chiang's competence and democratic credentials. In 1944, Japan tries to break the deadlock in multiple directions. In March, Japanese forces launch Operation Yugo into the Burma-India theater, with the aim of cutting Allied lines of communication to China and potentially toppling the British colonial government in India. Poor planning and British Indian resistance mean it fails at the battles of Kohima and Impal with heavy losses. Throughout late 1944, the Japanese launched their largest offensive of the entire war in China, Operation Ishigo. Once again, they make initial gains, linking up with Japanese forces in Indochina. But by early 1945, Ishigo is exhausted. Despite controlling more of China than ever, Ishigo still fails to shift the dynamic in Japan's favor or to end the war. It does, however, encourage the US to abandon plans to land in China and instead continue its drive through the Central Pacific, this time towards sovereign Japanese territory. Regardless of MacArthur's motivations, the Philippines was a vital Japanese logistical hub, housed major airfields, and constituted an allied government under enemy occupation. With Manila captured, the next US targets are Japanese sovereign territory. US commanders selected the tiny island of Iwo Jima as the next target in the island hopping strategy. Only 7.2 kilometers long and from 0.8 to 4 kilometers wide, it's an insignificant speck in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. But since it's located halfway between Tokyo and US air bases in the Marianas, Iwo Jima could become a vital support base for B-29 bombers, escort fighters, and search and rescue craft. Importantly, Iwo Jima is also part of the Tokyo prefecture and is sovereign Japanese soil. The Americans hope its capture will deliver a severe psychological blow to the Japanese. The US Marines 5th Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, is assigned the task of capturing the island, codenamed Operation Detachment. All told, 100,000 men and 700 ships will partake in a battle the Americans expect to last 5 to 10 days. Defending Iwo Jima are the 21,000 Japanese troops of the 109th Infantry Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi. Kuribayashi has studied the Battle of Peleliu closely, and instead of holding the Marines on the beach or relying on costly banzai attacks, he plans to allow the Marines ashore and grind them down in attritional warfare on 2 main defensive belts. Each consists of hundreds of caves, tunnels, and expertly hidden pillboxes, which the Japanese are to hold to the end. Kuribayashi's courageous battle vows order each of his soldiers to kill 10 invaders. The preparatory bombardment of Iwo Jima starts 3 days before D-Day, February 19th. This is much less than the 10 days requested by 5th Amphibious Corps Commander Major General Harry Schmidt. But as the 1st Marines move onto the 6 landing beaches at 9 a.m., Japanese resistance seems light. The biggest obstacle is a 4.5-meter high terrace of volcanic ash which hinders the men and prevents their supporting LVTs from moving ashore. Just as bulldozers are brought in to make a path, Kuribayashi unleashes his artillery. It's been pre-sighted to bracket the landing beaches and pounds the Marines, inflicting heavy casualties. Now Japanese machine guns open up from Mount Suribachi, a semi-active volcano and the highest point on the island. But the heaviest Japanese fire of all comes from the quarry on the extreme right of the landing beaches. Even before the invasion, 4th Division Commander Major General Clifton Cates had worried about it. You know, if I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad, of the right-hand company, of the right-hand battalion, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in. By 11 a.m., bulldozers have cleared a path from the beaches and the Marines begin to threaten Airfield No. 1. Meanwhile, the 28th Marine Regiment moves to cut off Mount Suribachi, creating a tenuous blockade. Colonel Harry Liversedge reports on the conditions. Troops ashore and moving to isolate volcano. Resistance moderate, but terrain awful. By the early afternoon, fighting dies down, but by the end of D-Day, only a third of the first day's objectives have been taken. The Marines capture Airfield No. 1, but elsewhere it's becoming clear Japanese resistance is stiffening. In the east, Marines grind up against the quarry, while the 28th moves around the base of Suribachi and its 70 reinforced concrete emplacements. Kuribayashi tries to stiffen his men's resolve. Each man should think of his defense position as his graveyard, fight until the last, and inflict much damage to the enemy. February 21st, D+2, brings the Americans a new enemy, the weather. Rain and wind shut down the beaches, while kamikazes attack the US naval vessels offshore and sink an escort carrier. On the island, the bloody fighting continues. In the west, the flatter terrain allows for the use of tanks, and the Americans make better progress. But against the quarry, US casualties mount. One company of 240 Marines is reduced to just 18 men fit for duty. Around 5,300 Marines have been killed or wounded in the first 3 days, so the reserve, the 3rd Division, is sent in ahead of schedule. Things did not improve as the rain turns Iwo Jima's volcanic sand into a sticky goo that clings to boots and fouls weapons. The 28th Marines reports. Bad weather and poor visibility throughout the day hampered our operations considerably. The rain mixed with volcanic dust caused stoppages in practically all automatic weapons, reducing them to single shot. Nonetheless, the Marines push ahead. The 28th now begins to scale Suribachi, while elsewhere the Marines attack Kuribayashi's main defensive belt. Kuribayashi has turned Iwo Jima into a complex network of interconnected and mutually supporting hardpoints of all shapes and sizes. Some are simple snipers' nests made from natural cracks in the rocks, while others are large reinforced blockhouses that seem impervious to even heavy artillery. The larger bunkers are well stocked with supplies and facilities. Japanese soldier Tsuchi Akikusa recalls. The Southern Islands Naval Air Station headquarters bunker was the largest bunker on the island, and it was rumored that it would be able to hold out for about 3 months. There were about 800 people in the bunker. There were no fewer than 500 drums filled with heavy oil, light oil, gasoline, and drinking water. With the aid of the tunnels, Japanese soldiers can move around the battlefield undetected and launch their feared night attacks, which increase in frequency with each passing day. As a result, after dark, American forces fire illumination shells to constantly bathe the island in light. The tunnels also allow the 800-man Japanese garrison at Suribachi to withdraw to the north just as the 28th begins its final assault on February 23rd. After meeting light resistance on the summit, Marines raised 2 US flags on the mountain to signal its capture, and in doing so, they create one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. But the capture of Suribachi does not mean the US has won the battle. The next day, US forces assault Airfield No. 2, but Japanese mines and anti-tank guns prevent the use of tanks. So it's up to American infantrymen armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and small arms to lead the assault. The Japanese stubbornly hold on at the north end, and US troops are only able to make serious advances in the west. Although the 4th Division clears the quarry in the east, they now clash against the toughest enemy position yet. On D+6, the Marines in the east entered the Meat Grinder, a complex of Japanese defenses centered on 3 locations: Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and a low basin known as the Amphitheater. Defenders in these positions can mutually support each other with machine guns, artillery, and dug-in tanks. American progress slows, with advances measured in 100-yard dashes, which the men call touchdowns. The 4th Division continues to struggle with the Meat Grinder over the coming days, while the other divisions also come up against their own hard points. On February 27th, the Americans consolidate their gains, but progress northwards is still being measured in touchdowns. The Japanese are stubbornly defending their positions, which often hold out until US armor assaults them from point-blank range, sometimes with Zippo Sherman flame-throwing tanks. American tankers also ram or churn their treads over cave entrances in order to collapse them. Japanese soldier Okoshi Harunori recalls his fears. Even if you pretended to die and fell over, on level ground American trucks and tanks would drive over you. Some of the soldiers hid in foxholes to avoid being run over, but when the American tanks found a foxhole, they would roll around on top of it and crush the people inside. If they got you like that, you were doomed to gurgle until you died. On February 28th, which US command originally expected to be the last day of the battle, victory still seems a distant prospect. With the East becoming a stalemate, Schmidt orders the 3rd Division to push in the center towards the coast, to split the Japanese defenders' last belt. With the aid of a massive artillery and air bombardment, the Marines surge forward and seize the remains of Airfield No. 2. By the next day, American forces are threatening the unfinished Airfield No. 3, while in the west, the 5th Marines now clash against Nishi Ridge, another prepared defensive position. In the east, Hill 382 is partially captured, but the Japanese on Turkey Knob and the Amphitheater continue to hold out. As American casualties and exhaustion mount, more and more NCOs take command of Marine units. In some cases, privates lead their units in assaults. But just as US forces are making progress in the east, the central drive bogs down. Japanese defenders on Hills 362B and C are holding up the Marines, with the summits heavily contested in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. By the following day, D12, a stalemate sets in. Marine casualties have been extremely high so far, 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. The Japanese have lost 14,000, almost all dead, and only have about 7,000 men left. In the west, the Americans capture Nishi and Hill 362A and fully surround the amphitheater. As the battle continues, the Marines also begin to note deceptive Japanese tactics. Japanese snipers dressed in Marine uniforms and armed with M1s were encountered. Also, it was discovered that the enemy was booby-trapping their dead. In anticipation of future offensives, Schmidt now orders 2 days of rest, except for smaller attacks to straighten out the line. Fresh American replacements arrive, but many of them have no combat experience. Airfield No. 1 sees some unusual activity today as damaged B-29 bomber Dynamite makes an emergency landing. The next day's American attack is preceded by a massive artillery bombardment. The guns fire over 22,500 shells in the first hour alone. However, their impact and the advance in general is disappointing from a US point of view. Fierce Japanese resistance limits the Marines to advances of only 50 to 100 meters across the whole island. It's become clear that Japanese are now well versed in the method and schedule of Marine attacks. An artillery barrage followed by infantry assault. So 3rd Division's General Graves Erskine suggests a dawn attack at 5 a.m. with no artillery. Graves' troops won't advance straight ahead as previously, but into a Japanese sector facing the neighboring 4th Division. The Americans try the new method for the first time on March 7th, and it seems to work, as by the end of the day they take Hill 362C. This advance started to create a pocket of Japanese resistance known as Cushman's Pocket, which continues to hold out. At midnight the same day, senior Japanese commander Captain Inoue Samaji ignores Kuribayashi's orders and leads a 1,500-man banzai attack from around Tachiwa Point. He hopes to pierce the US lines, destroy equipment, and even scale Suribachi to raise the Japanese flag again. But the Marines' fire decimates his men, some of whom are only armed with bamboo spears or explosive vests, from range. The Americans suffer few losses. The wasteful banzai charge marks the end of major resistance in the east. Over the next 3 days, the Marines bypass Japanese hardpoints in Cushman's Pocket and finally reduce the meat grinder. In the north, a US patrol reaches the sea before the Japanese push it back. Kuribayashi knows the battle is coming to a close, but he radios to Tokyo that he has no intention of surrendering. All surviving fighting units have sustained heavy losses. I am very sorry that I have let the enemy occupy one part of Japanese territory, but am taking comfort in giving him heavy damages. On D+20, Japanese resistance only exists in 3 isolated pockets: Cushman's Pocket, the eastern coast, and part of the northwest coast. Kuribayashi now falls back to a gorge, later dubbed Bloody Gorge, with his last 1,500 men. The Marines are exhausted, and many are incapacitated by a psychological condition they call combat fatigue, today known as PTSD. So they call on the Japanese to surrender and announce on loudspeakers that prisoners will be treated well and suicidal resistance is senseless. The Americans also distribute a translated letter from Japanese prisoner of war Hideo Momoda. Comrades, I myself would have never believed that things could be this way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. At first I was embarrassed to have been taken by the enemy, but when I learned that several officers had the same experience, I felt better. In our conversations, we agreed that it is more honorable to live for the Emperor and work for a greater Japan in the future than merely to die like rats underground. Messages like this one, though, have little impact. The Americans continue to advance and eliminate all Japanese strongpoints except for Bloody Gorge. Although US authorities declare Iwo Jima secure on March 14th, Kuribayashi continues to hold out for 9 more days in a seemingly impregnable blockhouse. US artillery couldn't be used for fear of friendly fire, so Marines armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition explosives take on the job of reducing it. On March 23rd, Kuribayashi sends his final communication to the Japanese garrison on nearby Chichijima. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. Kuribayashi's ultimate fate is not known. It's possible that he commits suicide or that he dies in one of the banzai attacks that become more common in the final days. On March 26th, around 200 to 300 Japanese troops sneak out of the Bloody Gorge and strike at Airfield No. 2, attacking mostly airmen and construction personnel. This charge, which US troops quickly destroy, signals the end of the battle. It's now D+35. Marine casualties are around 23,000, including 6,800 dead, while the Navy loses about 2,800 dead and wounded. 19,000 of the 21,000 Japanese troops on the island are killed. Only 216 surrender during the battle, and up to 2,000 continue to struggle in small groups until they're mopped up by US troops. Although the later Battle of Okinawa will prove even costlier for the Americans, Iwo Jima is still the deadliest single battle for the US Marines, and the only battle in the US Pacific campaign where American casualties outnumber those of the Japanese. Iwo Jima is also a battle with a controversial legacy. The US Army and Navy will later claim that the operation was of little use, especially for the price that was paid. But for its intended practical purposes, it does provide some immediate benefits. Throughout the last months of the war, 2,251 B-29s make emergency landings on Iwo, potentially saving the lives of 24,000 US airmen. The US strategy of island hopping ever closer to Japan brings American forces within reach of the Japanese home islands in the final year of the Second World War. The next US target is the Ryukyu Islands, a chain of 161 islands, of which Okinawa is the largest. US planners hope that Okinawa will also provide a base for a possible invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese know that Okinawa is strategically important and have built a naval base there in addition to 7 air bases on smaller islands nearby. Okinawa's terrain also favors the defense. The north is covered with rugged hills and deep ravines and gullies, while the somewhat flatter south has many limestone ridges and caves. There's also a large civilian population on the island. 435,000 people live mostly in the south. But these people are culturally different than the Japanese. They speak the Luchuan language, and many in the Japanese garrison look on the islanders as inferior. To ensure the loyalty of the isolated locals, the Japanese authorities make heavy use of propaganda to instill fear of the Americans and unquestioning loyalty to the emperor. The fear of a potential American landing is reinforced by US aerial bombing, which strikes the island repeatedly from September 1944. By early 1945, much of the capital city of Naha and its port are destroyed. So the Americans are planning to invade Okinawa, while the Japanese prepare the population and the landscape for maximum resistance. Both sides view the coming battle as a battle for Japan, and commanders on both sides will closely watch the performance of their troops for an insight into the potential invasion of the home islands. The defense of Okinawa is led by the Japanese 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. There are around 100,000 troops, but their training and quality vary. The 62nd and 24th Divisions are veterans of the Chinese campaigns, although the 24th lacks combat experience. They're supported by the understrength 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. To make up for losses, the Japanese also mobilize Air Force personnel, civilian naval staff, and Okinawan conscripts. 17 to 20,000 civilians form lightly armed Home Guard units, and 2,000 teenagers, some as young as 14, are organized into so-called Blood and Iron Students' Corps. The Japanese don't have much in the way of heavy weapons, but they do have enough artillery and mortars. The Allies bring far more to the battlefield at Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg. 100,000 soldiers and 88,000 Marines are ready for action, supported by 300 warships and 1,130 other vessels, along with Army and Navy Air Force cover overhead. US planners led by Admiral Raymond A. Spruance select a 12.8-kilometer stretch of beach on the west coast of the island for the landings. The plan is for US troops to fight their way ashore to capture the nearby Kadena and Yontan airfields. Then they would move to the narrowest parts of the islands and bottle up the Japanese before preparing for pushes north and south. 17-year-old Japanese ammo carrier Yagi Sei is overwhelmed at the sight of US power. The US fleet out there was just huge. The scale of the flotilla meant that the result of the battle was never in doubt. On March 29th, US forces take the nearby Keramaretto Islands and begin to bombard the Okinawa beaches with around 100,000 shells, rockets, and mortars. The invasion was about to begin, and US planners expected to be bloody. They predicted 85% casualties in the first assault waves. At 8:30 a.m. on April 1st, 1945, 2 US Marine and 2 US Army divisions hit the beaches on Okinawa. But as they come ashore, there's only sporadic Japanese mortar and artillery fire, no machine guns, and no Japanese troops. Marine Eugene Sledge, a veteran of the bloody Peleliu landings, is relieved. Images of the maelstrom at Peleliu had been flashing through my mind. But on Okinawa, there was practically no opposition to the landing. When we overcame our astonishment, everybody started laughing and joking. The release of the tension was unforgettable. Of the 50,000 US troops who landed, only 55 are killed or missing. The light US losses are part of the Japanese plan, though. General Ushijima decides not to contest the landings because he thinks that superior US firepower would wipe out his men. Instead, the Japanese plan to allow the Americans onto the island's central plains before grinding them away in attritional battles along the many ridges of southern Okinawa. Light Japanese forces will conduct harassment activities in the north, but the bulk will defend a series of lines back to the army headquarters in Suri Castle. Once the Americans got bogged down, Imperial headquarters promised an unprecedented air attack against the US fleet. Despite Tokyo's promises, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara is pessimistic. From the very start of the Okinawa battle, we were out of real touch with Imperial headquarters. Our fighting men made cynical and sarcastic remarks, such as, "Headquarters people will never come to Okinawa because Naha's red light district was burned down in air raids last October." American troops advanced for several days against only token resistance by inexperienced Japanese forces. They take the airfields April 2nd, reach the east coast on the 5th, and reach the Chatan Isthmus in the south. The island is now split in two, but as the US Marines move north and the Army moves south, Japanese resistance begins to stiffen. Japanese units and Okinawa irregulars begin to ambush Marines in hit-and-run attacks, especially on the forested Motobu Peninsula. On April 4th, US troops reached dug-in Japanese defenses, and the defenders managed to stop them at the Kakuza, Nishibaru, and Tombstone ridges in the west. Narrow passages hinder the US approach, but these confined spaces also increase Japanese casualties from artillery. To inflict 450 casualties on the 96th US Infantry Division, the Japanese 63rd Brigade lost around 5,700 men. Japanese morale does get a boost on April 12th when news of President Roosevelt's death reaches the front, but the desperate fighting continues. The Japanese are so desperate that they revert to very unorthodox tactics. Colonel Kaya, famous for his ingenuity, followed the example of Masashige Kusunoki, the great 14th century warrior, and harassed the enemy by dropping human excrement on them. Despite these measures, the Americans pierce the Japanese line, but come up against new Japanese defenses along Hacksaw Ridge. Exhausted US Army divisions are now being rotated out and replaced by fresher Marines. Major General Isamu Cho notices the US loss of momentum and demands more aggressive counterattacks against Colonel Yahara's advice. Cho's new counterattack on May 4th is supported by amphibious landings behind American lines, but it still fails. From now on, Yahara's strategy of attrition dominates, but hope for victory is slim. Cho even said jokingly to me, "Hey Yahara, when will it be okay for me to commit harakiri? Is this a good time?" He not only had assumed responsibility for the failed offensive, but now had lost all hope of success in any further operations. As the battle bogs down on land, another fierce struggle is fought at sea as the Japanese Air Force attempts to wipe out the entire US fleet. From April 6th, Japanese kamikaze pilots attack the 5th US fleet continuously. The Japanese Air Force turns to the suicide tactic after reports of its success in the Philippines. Kamikaze attacks are more accurate and damaging than conventional attacks, from which few Japanese pilots return in any case. The first raid of 355 kamikazes is just the beginning. Overall, about 1,800 kamikazes attacked US ships and Okinawan airfields between April and June. Many are shot down, but swarming tactics increase their chances of success, as US sailor J. Holmes aboard the destroyer Hadley writes about later. This was the granddaddy of them all. We didn't have time to count, but the records show the kamikazes came at us 10 at a time. As good as our gunners were, there was no way we were going to stop them all. By the end of the battle, kamikazes sink 26 US ships and damage 225 more, resulting in 9,700 US casualties, the highest losses for the Navy since Pearl Harbor. Kamikazes are not the only threat to American ships. On April 6th, the Japanese battleship Yamato, the biggest in the world, heads for Okinawa. It only has enough fuel for a one-way trip, and the plan is for the vessel to beach itself on the island and use its massive guns in support of the defenders. But US forces spot it halfway to its destination, and American bombers and torpedo bombers sink the Yamato with 3,000 of her crew. Back on deadlocked Okinawa, US forces regroup in late May and assault the toughest Japanese positions yet. To make matters worse, it rains almost incessantly. US troops move to outflank the Japanese strongpoint of Suri, but the defenders in the center hold on. Fierce fighting takes place around Sugarloaf and Horseshoe Hills in the west, while Army troops tackle Conical Hill in the east. Japanese defenders, often on reverse slopes, are able to inflict heavy casualties on US troops. As the weather worsens, the US advance slows again. The rain bothers both sides, but is particularly troublesome for the vehicle-dependent Americans. Sledge describes the desolate approach to Suri. It was the most ghastly corner of hell I'd ever witnessed. As far as I could see, an area that previously had been a low grassy valley with a picturesque stream meandering through it was a muddy, repulsive, open sore on the land. Every crater was half full of water, and many of them held a marine corpse. The bodies lay pathetically, just as they'd been killed, half submerged in muck and water, rusting weapons still in hand. The short ranges of the battles favor Japanese defenders and limit US artillery. In response, US troops use flamethrower tanks, satchel charges, and napalm to burn out defenders and collapse caves. In late May, the Japanese eastern flank collapses and the Americans take Naha. The Japanese attempt an airborne attack on May 25th, but US forces destroy it immediately. The Japanese are in danger of being surrounded, so they withdraw further south on May 29th. By this point, roughly 62,500 Japanese and 5,300 US troops have been killed. As the Japanese army withdraws, it takes civilians with it, while Home Guard units are ordered to delay the US pursuit. Okinawa's civilians play a unique role and suffer greatly during the battle on their island. During the battle, the Japanese partially evacuate the island and encourage civilians to flee the combat areas. Many civilians, however, choose to remain close to Japanese troops, while the army press gangs others as laborers, nurses, and sex slaves known as comfort girls. Because the Japanese make such intense use of propaganda, some Okinawans take their own lives rather than face the expected American brutality. At least 30 groups and families killed themselves en masse, often overseen by the Japanese military. Up to 700 civilians killed themselves on Kerama-Retto alone. US soldier Corporal Dan Lawler recalls Okinawan fears. "We gave them all some candy, but they still refused to touch it unless one of us ate some of it first. You could tell they didn't trust us as far as they could throw us." Civilian fears of US troops are compounded by the fact that many Marines are not used to fighting around civilians. Their shoot first, ask questions later mentality means that they frequently kill families hiding in caves and shoot some others as suspected infiltrators. The Japanese army even uses civilians like teenager Oshiro Kenki to cover its own retreat and conduct suicide attacks. "We had no idea where the Japanese army was. They'd simply abandoned our student group. We were simply given hand grenades and told not to throw them until we could see the whites of the Americans' eyes." By early June, the Japanese situation is desperate. About 30,000 troops remain, but many of them are wounded. The survivors retreat to the Kian Peninsula and prepare for a last stand. On June 4th, Marines conduct a shore-to-shore landing and attack the Japanese naval base on Oroku. With exhaustion and cases of combat fatigue increasing, US commanders try to convince the Japanese to surrender in vain. Close quarters fighting erupts around Kunishi Ridge, with the Japanese scoring a late success on the 18th. They managed to kill 10th US Army Commander, Lieutenant General Buckner. But the battle is all but decided. By June 21st, US tanks are converging on the Japanese 32nd Army headquarters. Ushijima orders a suicide charge out of the headquarters, which he intends to watch as he commits ritual suicide. Many other Japanese officers also resort to suicide charges as communications break down. Finally, in the early hours of June 23rd, Ushijima and a heavily intoxicated Cho kill themselves. Cho writes a poem before his death. The devil foe tightly grips our southwest land. His aircraft fill the sky. His ships control the seas. Bravely we fought for 90 days inside a dream. We have used up our withered lives, but our souls race to heaven. Other than a few isolated holdouts, the Battle of Okinawa mostly ends on June 22nd, 1945. The battle is one of the deadliest for the US military in World War II. 3,000 Marines, 4,600 Army soldiers, and 4,900 sailors are killed. Of the 100,000 Japanese troops, 66,000 are killed, and half of all survivors are wounded. Estimates on civilian deaths vary, but some range as high as 140,000. That's 1/3 of the island's indigenous population. Despite the huge casualties, the Japanese strategy is one of their most effective of the war. It grinds down US resources and morale, with many veteran soldiers now psychologically exhausted. The 82-day battle also gives a glimpse of what might be expected in a fight for the Japanese home islands, with a mobilized civilian population fighting in familiar territory with prepared positions and suicidal fanaticism. The Central Pacific Campaign brings US ground troops within reach of the Japanese home islands, but the experience has been difficult. US planners developed tentative plans for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Olympus and Coronet, for late 1945 and 1946. By summer 1945, only Olympus, the occupation of southern Honshu, is confirmed, but there's debate over casualty estimates. Post-war claims often state the US expects up to 1 million casualties in an invasion of Japan. However, there was no single estimate, as different branches developed their own. MacArthur, who would lead Olympus and wants the army to contribute to Japanese defeat, estimates casualties no higher than the Philippines campaign. Meanwhile, the Navy and Army Air Force post much higher estimates, perhaps to discourage an invasion which would downplay their contributions. Historian Rufus Miles, who favors lower casualty estimates, suggests Truman would simply not have authorized an invasion with such high casualty estimates. To argue that such a devastated and thoroughly beaten nation, whose armies in the Pacific had taken losses of 22 times as many deaths as they had inflicted on General MacArthur's forces during the march towards Japan in 1944 and 1945, could have inflicted some 500,000 deaths, 70% more than the 292,000 that the United States Armed Forces lost in all of World War II, on the world's best equipped Army, Navy, and Air Force, does not seem credible. Truman never approved a plan that would have involved such a mutual massacre, and, beyond any reasonable doubt, he never would have. Instead, some argue Truman didn't need to invade Japan. Throughout the war, other forces have been working with increasingly decisive effect. Since 1942, US submarines have been operating in Pacific waters. Early results, though, are not promising. A conservative strategy, poor experience, and malfunctioning torpedoes mean US submarines have a marginal impact on Japanese shipping in 1942. A shift in focus onto merchant shipping in 1943 improves results, but also increases US losses. Experience, better torpedoes, and new bases on US-captured Pacific islands allows submarines to have an even more successful 1944. US submarines sink 603 ships totaling 2.7 million tons. Although tanker tonnage still increases, it's a net loss of over 2 million tons. For the first time, Japanese merchant tonnage drops below 2 million tons, the minimum to maintain Japan's economy. Imports drop from 16.4 million tons to just 10 million. US submarines also enjoy more success against warships, as the Japanese Navy is increasingly confined, sinking 1 battleship, 7 aircraft carriers, and around 46 others. In fact, the Japanese never develop a coherent strategy against the US submarine campaign, partly because their naval doctrine focused nearly exclusively on decisive battles between surface fleets. They didn't even systematically adopt merchant convoys. By December 1944, Japanese merchant ships stick to coastal areas or harbors. US carrier-based aircraft largely eliminate the remaining Japanese merchant ships. By 1945, US submarines returned to more passive duties for lack of targets and for fear of friendly fire with US warships. One important task for American subs is supporting a new strategic bombing campaign of Japan by rescuing downed pilots and providing weather forecasting. In early 1945, Japan's continued economic destruction will come from the air. Early in the war, US bombers are limited by geography, with Japan out of range from land-based airfields. On April 18, 1942, the US launches its first bombing raid of Japan in the Doolittle Raid. Modified B-25 bombers take off from aircraft carriers roughly 1,000 kilometers from Japan, bomb Tokyo, and then land in friendly China. The raid causes little damage, though, and is not part of a long-term campaign. High aircraft losses, Japanese reprisals in China, and the Japanese execution of captured crew dissuade further attacks. In late 1943, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized Operation Matterhorn. B-29 superfortresses, long-range, high-altitude bombers, will attack Japan from bases in China. But Japan's industrial heartland is still out of range. Plus, supplies must be flown over the Himalayas, which limits bomb loads and maintenance, and Japanese forces in China threaten the air bases. Furthermore, the B-29 bomber has problems. It's larger and more complex than other bombers, and its engines are prone to fires, resulting in high mission abort rates and accidents. Major General Curtis LeMay of 20 Bomber Command later remarks, B-29s had as many bugs as the entomological department of the Smithsonian Institute. Matterhorn's results are disappointing. By November, 20 Bomber Command has only flown 5 missions against Japan, and Matterhorn is de-emphasized due to expense and the Japanese capture of Chinese air bases. Another factor is that in July 1944, US forces capture the Mariana Islands. They are in B-29 range of Tokyo and take over as the primary strategic bombing base. But early results still aren't good. General Haywood Hansell of 21 Bomber Command uses high-altitude precision methods with high explosives. The long-distance, light bomb loads, high abort rate, and poor high-altitude weather conditions over Japan limit effectiveness. General LeMay argues against the precision bombing methods, claiming Japanese industry is too dispersed among the residential areas to be accurately hit. He suggests low-altitude area bombing with incendiary bombs. US studies highlight Japanese cities' vulnerability to fire. Large sections of the great Japanese cities are built of flimsy and highly flammable materials. The earthquake disaster of 1924 bears witness to the fearful destruction that may be inflicted by incendiary bombs. LeMay experimented with area bombing in Europe, but the method was not widely adopted by the US Army Air Force. But Pacific US bomber commanders are more independent. By December, 20 Bomber Command's B-29s consolidate in the Marianas, and LeMay replaces Hansell as commander. LeMay improves bomber infrastructure and maintenance programs. US Army Air Force Commander General Henry Hap Arnold orders him to continue daylight precision bombing, and results remain poor. Some commanders resist low-level firebombing, including Arnold and Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Some resistance is for operational reasons, as Japanese anti-aircraft fire threatens low-level raids. Other concerns are ethical, as firebombing deliberately targets civilians. But historians and contemporaries notice a different public attitude to targeting Japanese civilians compared to German. Racism plays a role, as does the legacy of Pearl Harbor and Japanese atrocities. Many Americans also view Japanese civilians as more willing and eager participants in the war effort than their German counterparts. One air commander in Europe wrote, "Like every American who flies to Europe for combat duty, I regret my failure to get the desired crack at the Jap. I failed to possess any real enmity towards Jerry and sensed a certain repulsion to European bombings where non-combatant Axis life might be involved. Commanders' attitudes shift in early 1945, especially as Germany's defeat appears imminent. Many believe Japan will soon surrender, and commanders want bombers to visibly contribute to victory. Firebombing supporters argue it ultimately saves lives by ending the war sooner, or that the method of killing is irrelevant. From the practical standpoint of the soldiers out in the field, it doesn't make any difference how you slay the enemy. Everybody worries about their own losses. But to worry about the morality of what we were doing? Nuts. A soldier has to fight. We fought. If we accomplished the job in any given battle without exterminating too many of our own folks, we considered that we'd had a pretty good day. In February 1945, LeMay's bombers experiment with high-level firebombing raids. Again, B-29s suffer from mechanical issues and poor accuracy due to high-altitude winds. LeMay shifts to low-level night raids to reduce engine stress and take advantage of Japan's lack of night fighters. Crews remove defensive guns to reduce weight and increase bomb loads. On March 9th, LeMay tests the new methods over Tokyo with Operation Meeting House. B-29s target 6 industrial areas in densely populated residential districts, as LeMay argues Japanese homes function as cottage industries. 279 B-29s bombed the city with incendiaries, triggering a firestorm. Fire, heat, smoke, boiling canals, and melted glass kill thousands, as others suffocate in shelters. Meeting House kills between 84 and 100,000 Japanese, destroys 40 square kilometers, and renders 1 million homeless. 6th grader Kazuyo Funato recalls, "The wind and flames became terrific. We were in hell. All the houses were burning, debris raining down on us. It was horrible. Sparks flew everywhere. Electric wires sparked and toppled. Mother, with my little brother on her back, had her feet swept out from under her by the wind, and she rolled away. Father jumped after her. 'Are you all right?' he screamed. Yoshiaki shouted, 'Dad!' I don't know if his intention was to rescue father or to stay with him, but they all disappeared instantly into the flames and black smoke." Soon afterwards, similar raids target other cities, including Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Japanese air defense is minimal. In July 1945, Lieutenant General Carle Spaatz arrives from Europe to command the new United States Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific. A critic of area bombing, he shifts targeting to pre-invasion targets, such as railways and ammunition plants, although his firebombing raids continue. However, he will soon have a new weapon, the atomic bomb. August 1945 proves momentous for both Japan and China. Although Japan has suffered military disasters, it has significant forces in China. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists claw back some territory, while Chiang's US Chief of Staff Albert Wedemeyer makes ambitious plans for a dash to the coast. Such a Chinese effort, though, proves unnecessary, as the atomic bombings and a Soviet offensive give Chiang an unexpected victory. But first, let's take a step back and establish the events from July and early August 1945. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied and Soviet forces. In July, the victors met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin. Near the top of the agenda was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the USSR was still neutral. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his 1943 promise to the Brits and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria, plus South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. He also revealed the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace feelers since 1943. By 1945, it was clear they wanted to use the neutral USSR as a mediator to end the war on better terms. Now remember, testing vague peace ideas with a potential mediator country is not the same as being willing to surrender. All the while, Japan's military was preparing the home islands for defense and blocked any serious peace efforts by politicians. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who favored peace, did not want it at any price. Meanwhile, at Potsdam, US President Harry Truman received a short telegram from the US on July 16th. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet completed, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. This message meant that the first atomic weapons test in New Mexico had been a success. On July 24th, Truman casually informed Stalin of, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, equally casually, suggested good use of the bomb could be made against Japan. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR didn't sign. They called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face, quote, prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government was divided on how to respond. Emperor Hirohito was head of state, but the country was actually governed by the so-called Big Six cabinet ministers. 3 ministers wanted to ask the Allies for clarification, while the other 3, all military, wanted to reject the proclamation. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored it, but they could not ignore what happened next. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It exploded 600 meters above the city, causing ground temperatures to reach 4,000 degrees centigrade. Nearly everyone within 1 kilometer was killed instantly, and those within a 3.5 kilometer radius were terribly burned. High school student Yamaoka Michiko recalled the moment of the explosion. There was no sound. I felt something strong. It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. I thought I would be the only one to die. I said to myself, "Goodbye, Mom." The bomb destroyed 70,000 of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings and killed up to 110,000 people. The White House released a statement. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So in August 1945, the US plays its trump card against Japan. Historians have since argued whether the bombings were primarily intended to cause Japanese surrender or to threaten the Soviet Union. Stalin knew of the US atomic program, but was equally taken by surprise. He's now concerned if Japan surrenders before the USSR can join the war, he'll lose what was promised at Yalta and Potsdam. On August 8th, Japanese officials again approached the Soviet Union to intervene diplomatically, but the Soviets give them a declaration of war instead. Taking into account the refusal of Japan to capitulate, the Allies approached the Soviet government with a proposal to join the war against Japanese aggression. The Soviet government has accepted the proposal of the Allies. From August 9th, the Soviet Union will consider herself in a state of war against Japan. 1.6 million Soviet troops invade Manchuria and Korea on 3 fronts. They plan a simple but massive pincer attack against the Japanese Kwantung Army and the occupation of territory promised to Stalin. The Kwantung Army is elite by Japanese standards, but by 1945 it's been stripped of its best units. By August, it has 780,000 troops, but many are new and badly prepared conscripts. The Japanese mobilized the physically infirm, the overage, civil servants, colonists, and students. As late as August 1945, the higher echelons of the Kwantung Field Army were living in a fool's paradise. In Manchuria, there was still no sense of crisis in spite of the atomic bomb. The highly mechanized Soviet force and their Mongolian allies smash the Japanese defenders and rapidly advance. On August 10th, Soviet forces push into South Sakhalin Island, and on August 15th, land on the North Kurile Islands. These rushed attacks go less smoothly. In the attack on Shumshu, Japanese defenders kill up to 2,400 Soviet troops for just 200 Japanese killed, marking the only battle of the Soviet offensive in which Soviet casualties outnumber Japanese. The Japanese cabinet finally met but couldn't agree on what to do. Civilian ministers wanted to surrender on the condition the emperor could remain, while most military ministers demanded no occupation, voluntary disarmament of Japanese forces, and Japanese-controlled war crime trials. While they discussed, the second atomic bomb hit Nagasaki, killing 40,000. The emperor himself now intervened with an unprecedented sacred decision to surrender with one condition: his own retention as monarch. The Japanese sent these terms to the Americans on August 10th, and the US didn't refuse, but didn't accept either. They simply repeated that the Japanese people would choose their own government. On August 15th, after a badly organized military coup by junior officers failed, Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender unconditionally. Fighting in Manchuria stopped on August 16th, and the war formally came to an end September 2nd, 1945. Few events of the Second World War have triggered more historical debate than those of August 1945. Historians have long argued whether the atomic bombs were necessary and which factors were most important in causing the Japanese to surrender. The conventional view, supported by orthodox historians, mostly follows the mainstream post-war American perspective, that the bombs were the decisive factor in the Japanese surrender. But other historians have argued a different view, that the intervention of the Soviet Union in the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, actually triggered the Japanese surrender and arguably made the bombs unnecessary. This view is often called revisionist, since it revises or changes the older orthodox argument. Evolving arguments are a normal part of historians' work in trying to explain the past, and there are differences within the orthodox and revisionist schools of thought on the bomb, so these labels are a bit simplified to help us get to the core of the issue. Since 1943, the US military had been drawing up plans for a possible invasion of Japan. They expected the Japanese would resist with fanaticism based on assessments like this one from former ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew. "I know Japan. I lived there for 10 years. The Japanese will not crack. They will not crack morally or psychologically or economically, even when eventual defeat stares them in the face. They will pull in their belts another notch, reduce their rations from a bowl to half a bowl, and fight to the bitter end." The bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 reinforced these claims. The invasion was to happen in two phases. Allied troops would land at Kyushu on November 1st, 1945, then capture the Tokyo Plain in March 1946. The Japanese Ketsu-go defense plan was not to defeat the invasion, but to inflict enough losses on the Americans so Japan could get better peace terms. With some casualty estimates suggesting deaths far in excess of previous invasions, Truman reportedly sees the atomic bombs as a way to avoid a bloody invasion and still bring Japanese surrender. He wrote to his wife, "I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed." Truman was also under public pressure to end the war soon with minimal losses, while simultaneously not letting Japan off lightly. The bombs ticked both of these boxes. After the bombings, opinion polls showed 85% of Americans supported their use and 23% wanted to drop even more. But the atomic bombs were not guaranteed to work, and for this reason, some Orthodox historians say Truman still wanted Soviet help. Revisionist historians, on the other hand, claim Soviet intervention became Truman's worst-case scenario. For revisionists, the atomic bombings had more to do with containing the Soviet Union than with defeating Japan. The dropping of the atomic bombs was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first major operation of the Cold War with Russia. They argue that although Truman wanted Soviet assistance before Potsdam, he then changed his mind. Revisionists highlight that Stalin never received an official invitation to join the war. Instead, they suggest that Truman wanted an insurance policy in case the bombs didn't work. Stalin provided this by confirming Operation August Storm would start on August 15th. Once Truman had reliable data from the bomb test success on July 21st, revisionists claim that he drastically shifted his position to ending the war before the August 15th Soviet offensive could begin. This led the revisionists to conclude that Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw a chance to limit Soviet influence and prevent the USSR from getting the Japanese islands and influence in northern China that they'd been promised. Some in the US government worried that the Soviets couldn't be trusted to respect an agreement, especially on the question of free elections in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, any deal involving China still needed to be run past Chiang Kai-shek. Truman himself wrote his opinion in his memoirs. "I was not willing to let Russia reap the fruits of a long and bitter and gallant effort in which she had had no part." Revisionists also suggest that far from offering Japan an opportunity to surrender, the Potsdam Proclamation was deliberately designed to be unacceptable, thereby justifying the use of the bombs. Several members of the US delegation, like Stimson, wanted to adjust the unconditional surrender demand to guarantee the emperor, but he was overruled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Burns. But when the US dropped the Hiroshima bomb, revisionists argue that instead of intimidating the Soviets, it actually spurred them on. Stalin knew about the bomb program thanks to his spies, but the test was a surprise. Apparently outraged, he brought forward the invasion date to August 9th. So the orthodox argument that the bombs were dropped to save lives has been questioned by revisionists who argue that it was primarily to prevent Soviet gains in Asia. A minority of revisionists have even argued that the US dropped the bombs partly out of grim scientific curiosity or to justify the expense of developing them, but the evidence for this is weaker. That said, Orthodox and revisionist schools also disagree about another critical question. Why exactly did Japan surrender? Orthodox historians suggest that Japan would fight on if it felt that its defensive plan to kill as many Allied troops as possible had a chance of working. The bombs, though, weakened Japanese belief that determined defense and Soviet mediation might end the war on better terms. According to this line of thought, Japanese leaders now accepted that their country could be bombed into submission, especially if the US was going to drop more atomic bombs after the first two. Maybe they would even drop one on Tokyo. In reality, Truman planned to scale back bombings after Nagasaki, and Tokyo was never an atomic target. But the Japanese didn't know this. Their fears, Orthodox historians claim, were increased by the shock of the atomic bombs, since Japanese scientists had theorized them, but were nowhere near developing them. Japan's leaders also considered the atomic bombs a critical threat to Japanese civilians. Orthodox historians have pointed to evidence like this statement from Hirohito to a close advisor. "Now that things have come to this impasse, we must bow to the inevitable. No matter what happens to my safety, we should lose no time in ending the war so as not to have another tragedy like this." Orthodox historians also say that the Soviet attack was not all that important in Japan's decision to capitulate. Japanese leaders knew a Soviet offensive was possible, so its shock impact was minimal. One piece of evidence on this point is a statement by Deputy Army Chief Torashiro Kawabe. "Although we have long worried about the question of Soviet entry, a surprise attack with this new atomic weapon was beyond our wildest dreams." In the Orthodox argument, the Soviet attack was concerning to the Japanese, but not a critical threat to the home islands or the Ketsugo plan. In any case, Japan expected to lose Manchuria in a peace deal anyway. So the Orthodox position is that Japan surrendered because of the destruction of the atomic bombs and the potential for more of the same. The revisionist approach, though, sees it very differently. They suggest that the impact of the bombs has been exaggerated since the war, while the impact of the Soviet invasion has been minimized. Firstly, revisionists argue that the destruction from the atomic bombs was not so different from the impact of conventional US strategic bombing. On March 9th, a US raid on Tokyo killed 84,000 people, more than the lower estimates for Hiroshima and more than the immediate death toll at Nagasaki. In any case, most Japanese cities were already destroyed by the time the atomic bombs were invented. Historian Robert Pape put it this way: "If one defines the hostage as major and secondary cities with over 100,000 people, then the hostage was nearly dead before the atomic bombs fell." After the war, a US strategic bombing survey estimated that the atomic bomb did as much damage as 210 conventional bomber sorties. In August 1945, 21st Bomber Command was flying 1,200 sorties every week. Revisionists claim that this reduced the shock of the atomic bomb since the Japanese leadership already expected mass death from more conventional bombing or an invasion. The Japanese military didn't really react much to the first atomic bomb and even doubted an atomic weapon had been used at all. That's why they said they had more important things to do than attend a cabinet meeting on August 8th. According to the revisionists, the atomic bombings did not encourage surrender and instead reinforced the Japanese plan to defend the home islands and seek Soviet mediation. In fact, Japanese generals reasoned atomic bombs wouldn't even be much use during an invasion. The most important reason Japan abandoned the plan to fight to the end, in revisionist eyes, was the Soviet declaration of war. The atomic bombs created confusion at the top, but the Soviet attack was the realization of the worst-case scenario. Once the Soviets declared war, all hope for mediation via the USSR was gone. Although somewhat anticipated, revisionists suggest this resulted in an even bigger shock than the bomb. One piece of evidence for this is General Kawabe's post-war statement. Since Tokyo was not directly affected by the bombing, the full force of the shock was not felt. In comparison, the Soviet entry into the war was a great shock when it actually came. It gave us all the more severe shock and alarm because we'd been in constant fear that the vast Red Army forces in Europe were now being turned against us. Kawabe is a prime example of how isolated statements from leading figures can be contradictory. In the previous section of this video, his words are used to support the orthodox position as well. Tokyo also worried the Soviet involvement might trigger communist uprisings in Japan, which might end the imperial dynasty for good. Revisionists argue that this is what convinced even the military to accept the Potsdam Proclamation. For revisionist historians, the opinions of military leaders in the Big Six are particularly important. They were the strongest faction within the cabinet and had previously vetoed peace overtures. But after the Soviet invasion, revisionists say that even the military leaders decided to surrender, although they still debated its exact terms. The senior officers accepted Hirohito's sacred decision and never launched a full-scale military coup. Revisionists also claim that Hirohito was not motivated to save civilian lives since he didn't do anything to stop the deaths from conventional strategic bombing, and that his real priority was saving his family's imperial regalia and shrines from invasion or communist revolution. So the orthodox thinking is that the bombs forced the Japanese to surrender, while the revisionists argue it was the Soviet intervention. All these discussions have led historians to wonder whether the US might have forced Japan to surrender a different way, without the bombs at all. One of the most debated what-ifs is the idea that Japan was likely to surrender before a US invasion took place. Revisionists have floated the possibility that if the Allies had guaranteed the emperor in the Potsdam Proclamation, the Japanese would have given up sooner. Even the US War Department Operation Division recognized the importance of the emperor. The primary intention in issuing the proclamation is to induce Japan's surrender, and thus avoid the heavy casualties implied in a fight to the finish. It is almost universally accepted that the basic point on which the acceptance of surrender terms will hinge lies in the question of the disposition of the emperor and his dynasty. Therefore, from the military point of view, it seems necessary to state unequivocally what we intend to do with regard to the emperor. The revisionists maintain that the US failure to heed this advice and the dropping of the bombs probably delayed the end of the war. They also raise other possibilities that might have led to Japanese surrender instead of the bombs, like keeping up the naval blockade or conventional bombing. Both submariner and bombing commanders feel their branches acted decisively and deserve credit for defeating Japan. Some officers in both the conventional bomber and submarine forces are frustrated with the circumstances of Japanese surrender. The novel nature of the atomic bombs looks likely to overshadow their contributions, or suggest Japan surrendered because of the atomic bombings alone. This issue has since been widely debated, with one opinion arguing Japan was on the verge of surrender before the atomic bombings. Which branch of the military deserves credit for this is a topic of further debate. Proponents of conventional bombing argue the massive destruction wrought by firebombing had a decisive impact on the war economy from early 1945. Casualty estimates vary, but a 1947 survey claims firebombing kills 900,000 Japanese. More recent estimates place the figure around 300,000 or 400,000 killed. Bombing also makes 8.5 million homeless, around 30% of the urban population, as bombers destroy 465 square kilometers in 66 cities. The 1946 US Bombing Survey Group claims physical damage to plants significantly reduced industrial production of key war materials. Furthermore, bombing encouraged a dispersal of industry, reducing its efficiency, while even intact factories were affected by worker absenteeism, disintegrated supply systems, and transport overburdened with fleeing civilians. Lost labor hours doubled from 1944 to July 1945, despite the total labor force increasing. This destruction was also achieved with relatively low US casualty rates. 2,600 B-29 crew died in the Pacific Campaign, the majority in non-combat incidents. Mechanical improvements meant by July 1945, only 0.4% of bomber crews became casualties. By comparison, of the 16,000 US submariners who went on combat patrols, 3,500 were killed, 22%. Others highlight the psychological effect of B-29 bombings, which were highly visible to Japanese leaders and civilians. After the war, several Japanese leaders, like Premier Kantaro Suzuki, claim firebombing is decisive in forcing them to accept defeat. It seemed to me unavoidable that, in the long run, Japan would be almost destroyed by air attack, so that merely on the basis of the B-29s alone, I was convinced that Japan should sue for peace. I felt that the cause was hopeless. Others argue the morale-dampening effects of strategic bombing have been exaggerated, and there were no mass public demands for surrender in Japan or Germany. The bombing survey accepts B-29 raids influenced some, but not all Japanese leaders. Even so, it concludes conventional bombing alone probably could have compelled Japanese surrender by November 1945. But others argue Japan's economy was in ruins even before the conventional bombing campaign started, thanks largely to American submarines. Although post-war surveys drastically reduce US submarines' wartime claims, submarines still sink a total of 4.7 million tons of merchant shipping, 60% of the total. Of the 122,000 Japanese merchant marine personnel in 1941, submarines claimed to kill or incapacitate 69,000. Even if Japanese merchantmen survive a sinking, they're still at risk from follow-up attacks by other forces. Yoshio Otsu survived the sinking only to be attacked by US aircraft. Seeing no one on board, they strafed those in the water. The swine. Not satisfied with sinking the ship, they must kill those swimming in the sea. Was this being done by human beings? We were utterly helpless. The result of merchantmen sinkings and casualties, some argue, is the collapse of the import-dependent Japanese war economy. Stockpiled resources allowed some war production to remain steady until 1944, but by late 1944, there was a significant shortage of iron ore, oil, and fuel. By December, oil imports to southern Japan cease and steel production collapses. Iron ore from China, which originally furnished 90% of Japanese demand, drops from an average 203,000 tons per month in early 1944 to just 37,000 tons in December. The lack of essential raw materials means that although war production continues, fuel shortages disrupt critical phases of production. Some argue these declines start before the strategic air campaign got seriously underway. 75% of Japanese tonnage is sunk before January 1945, and many bombed factories were already far underproducing due to material shortages. One aircraft plant in Ota dropped from 300 airframes a month to 100 before it was first bombed in February 1945. The Economic Division's report states, "The Japanese economy was in effect drying up at the roots from 6 months to a year before the period of intensive air attack and ultimate collapse." Lockwood highlights this contribution is made with a comparatively tiny amount of people, around 50,000 or 1.6% of Navy personnel. Submarines largely act independently and didn't rely heavily on other supporting arms either. Meanwhile, B-29s require significant logistics and islands in range of Japan. The battles of Saipan and Iwo Jima, which killed up to 68,000 US and Japanese troops and civilians, are largely to secure airfields and support B-29 bombing raids. Even the US bombing survey accepts the war against merchantmen was the most decisive factor in the economic war against Japan, and that submarines contributed most sinkings. However, B-29s also sink merchantmen, especially from early 1945. B-29s lay 12,000 mines in coastal areas, closing 19 of 22 repair yards and sinking or damaging beyond repair 283 ships, or 60% of sinkings between March and August 1945. Unable to use coastal shipping routes, Japanese merchantmen stay in harbor or make longer, dangerous journeys. The US bombing survey argues the B-29 mining campaign alone could have crippled the Japanese economy, although it accepts this would have taken longer. Ultimately, supporters of conventional bombing argue it was the more visible nature of the firebombing raids and the subsequent psychological impact which made it decisive. Supporters of submarines argue that they also had a psychological impact on the Japanese population by affecting food, 20% of which came from overseas. They argue the threat of near-starvation conditions was more influential on Japanese civilians and leaders than the destruction of urban areas. B-29 planners also devised plans to hit Japanese rice farms and fisheries with biological weapons, although this was ultimately rejected. There's no consensus in this debate, and both submariner and bomber commanders have a vested interest in promoting their contributions after the war. They know after Japanese surrender, the US needs to demobilize. As expensive arms, submarines and strategic bombers are on the cutting block. This is especially true when the US develops Japan into a regional ally. And the US Army Air Force is also eager to become an independent branch after the war. Orthodox arguments also point to the high death rates that further strategic bombing, a starvation blockade, or a Soviet invasion would have caused, perhaps taking more lives than the bombs did even without a US invasion, including amongst the peoples under Japanese occupation. An additional argument is that the bombs actually gave Japan a justification for surrender. Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizo's post-war thoughts provide some evidence for this. The atomic bomb was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. There were those who said that the Japanese armed forces were not defeated. It was in science that Japan was defeated, so the military will not bring shame on themselves by surrendering. The orthodox versus revisionist argument is further complicated by tricky historical sources too. There's a lack of fully reliable primary sources for August 1945, and many of the letters or diaries written at the time are incomplete or they're contradictory. Post-war memoirs are also problematic since many decision-makers tried to put themselves in a good light in the new environment of the Cold War or war crimes trials. Evidence obtained from post-war US interrogations has also been questioned. Aside from sources, the whole debate relies on the assumption that a single person or unit was responsible for important decision-making. In reality, such complex decisions are the result of networks of people, power struggles, attitudes, institutions, and personalities that can also change their position over time. So, did the US drop the atomic bombs to avoid a costly invasion, or to limit Soviet influence in Asia? Did Japan surrender because of the bombs or because of the Soviet declaration of war? Did the bombs ultimately save lives, or could more people have lived if they'd not been dropped? Even today, almost 80 years later, the debates around the end of the Second World War are just as heated and explosive as ever. By the end of August 1945, a small contingent of US troops is on the ground in Japan, there to secure key sites, take charge of released Allied prisoners, and prepare for Douglas MacArthur's arrival. He will oversee the surrender ceremony and eventually organize the post-war occupation of Japan. Tension is high as staff arrive, vastly outnumbered by armed Japanese. Along the roadway, the 15 miles to Yokohama, they stood in a long line on each side, their backs to MacArthur in a sign of respect. There were 2 divisions of them, 30,000 men fully armed. I must say that I regarded these formidable-looking troops with a wary eye. My misgivings were not put at rest by this display because I could not help wondering whether the Japanese intended it as a gesture of deference, whether they felt that a strong guard like this was really necessary, or whether there was some other deep-seated, mysterious, ulterior motive. On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese formally signed the Articles of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Pacific War and the Second World War is over. Including the Chinese and Burma theaters, Allied casualties are around 2.3 million killed, the vast majority of them Chinese. Japanese military casualties are around 2.2 million killed, mostly in China, the Philippines, and the Central Pacific. Civilian casualties are hard to estimate, but may be as high as 27 million, including around 14 million Chinese and 1 million Japanese. Under US occupation, Japan adopts a new constitution which destroys its war-making powers. It must also try war criminals, dissolve its empire, and democratize. A lack of US expertise in Japanese culture or language means the occupation is largely supervisory. The US maintains key Japanese institutions, most notably the Emperor's Court, to maintain stability. This contrasts with Germany, in which most government institutions are rebuilt from scratch. Furthermore, in Japan, the US doesn't need to cooperate with other nations, which allows more consistency. MacArthur's personal leadership is the driving factor in occupation policy. Initially, Japan was to be economically limited to prevent rearmament, but fresh global crises bring changes. The communist victory over Chiang's nationalists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 mean the US needs a strong, self-sufficient ally in Asia. Japanese resources begin to support a larger US presence in the region, boosting the economy and requiring its modernization, especially in steel, automobiles, and electronics. By the mid-1950s, Japan has been transformed from America's greatest enemy to one of its closest allies. We want to thank the Royal Armouries and Christoph Bergs for their help with this documentary. To learn more about the Second World War in Asia, check out our documentary about the Second Sino-Japanese War. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that prefers Cornetto ice cream cones over Operation Cornetto.